Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Musée Cernuschi for this afternoon dedicated to the study of Asian artists working in France and co-jointly organized by National Gallery of Singapore and Musée Cernuschi, which is the Museum for Asian Arts in Paris. We are absolutely honored by the presence of Mrs. Fu Li, who's the ambassador to Singapore in France, and she will be talking in a minute. We're also very happy to welcome our colleagues from Singapore. I want to thank Mr. Eugene Tan, the director, Mr. Patrick Flores, deputy director of the museum, and the whole team of the National Gallery Singapore, who actively participated and collaborated with the museum in a remarkable way to organize this afternoon. The museum, founded by Henry Cernuschi in the 19th century, opened to Asian art for the past 80 years for modern and contemporary. Until the 19th century, the exhibitions of the Musée Cernuschi were dedicated to modern and contemporary artists, enabled the French audience to discover works that were not very much exhibited so far outside of Asia. So this close relationship with artists also enabled us to build one of the largest collections in Europe. This dynamic informed the identity of Musée Cernuschi and couldn't have happened without the decisive role of artists working in France. This is why, for the past 15 years, Musée Cernuschi has sought to highlight the work of these artists through a series of exhibitions with Lefebvre, Mai-Thu, Cao Dam, the pioneers of modern Vietnamese modern art in France. And this is an exhibit that is currently at the museum, and I'm of course inviting you to see it. This year, 2025, a new step has happened with the creation of a resource and studies center dedicated to Asian artists working in France within the Musée Cernuschi. This center will enable us to reinforce research on these artists in France, but also to develop exchanges at academic level, as we're currently doing, today, thanks to the National Gallery Singapore. National Gallery Singapore undertook pioneer research on Vietnamese artists working in France. And so for a number of years with this research, our colleagues from Singapore has created the ambitious project and unique project to gather together artists from many Asian countries working in France in an exhibition called City of Others, Asian Artists in Paris, 1920s, 1940s, which will open on April 2nd. And of course, I'm looking forward to discovering it. So I just want to wish you a very pleasant afternoon with the curators and researchers of National Gallery of Singapore and Musée Cernuschi. Thank you very much.
Mr. Eric Lefebvre, Director of the Musée Cernuschi, colleagues and friends from both the Musée Cernuschi and National Gallery Singapore, ladies and gentlemen both here at the museum and those tuning in via the live stream, bonjour à toutes et à tous. I'm pleased to be here to give very short remarks at this symposium in conjunction with the two exhibitions, Pioneers of Vietnamese Modern Art in France, here at the Cernuschi, and the forthcoming City of Others, Asian Artists in Paris from the 1920s to the 1940s at the National Gallery Singapore. More than that, I'm very pleased to be here because the Cernuschi is not only a close partner of the embassy, but we are just neighbor, just across the Parc Monceau. This year is a very important year for Singapore. Singapore celebrates 60 years of our independence this year. And it is also a very important year for Singapore and France relations. When we declared independence, France is among the first 11 countries to immediately recognize our independence in 1965. So this year, both our countries will be celebrating our 60 years of bilateral diplomatic ties. And we look forward to celebrating this momentous occasion with President Macron's visit to Singapore in May, which we will see our bilateral relation upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership, the first we have with the EU member state. Incidentally, the Singapore Embassy has also created a logo to mark the milestone, which I think you'll see on the screen, featuring the iconic lion head and the Gallic rooster from Singapore and France, respectively. Our partnership with France has thrived over the 6 decades because both Singapore and France share a rich cultural heritage and a strong dedication to promoting the arts and the heritage. Whether it is in culinary art, fashion, performing, visual or literary arts, both Singapore and France share a firm commitment to preserving our heritage and at the same time fostering creativity. I met several Singaporean and French artists, art business owners, and administrators in October last year at the reception, which my embassy hosted in conjunction with the Asia Now Arts Fair, and I was happy that Eric could join us last year. And what struck me was not just the deep respect and genuine curiosity that both sides have in each other's pursuit, but also the strong sense of friendship and comfort, when we meet each other. Singapore is a fairly young city-state. We are just 60 years old, coming to be 60-year-olds this year. And we are also a port city which draws upon the heritage and cultural influences from around the world. The 2 exhibitions at the Cernuschi and National Gallery Singapore, and indeed this symposium, are emblematic of the story of Singapore's history and development, in particular, the interaction and exchange of ideas between Asian artists and France, and of course the latter, with its long-standing artistic and cultural legacy, is really the Mecca of arts and culture. Before I end, I wanted to say that this is just the first in a lineup of several commemorative events my embassy and other agencies from Singapore hope to present to the French audience as we celebrate the 60 years of our bilateral ties and partnership this year. I hope that this symposium will set the tone for greater dialogue, exchange of expertise, and the deepening of bonds, not just in arts and culture, but in all other sectors. Please look out on the Embassy Social for information on such activities and events throughout the year. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I give the floor to the curators of the 2 exhibitions for the next part of the symposium program. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Her Excellencies, Ms. Fu and Eric, for the welcome speeches. Hello, everyone. Bonjour to all our distinguished guests joining us in person at Musée Cernuschi, and good evening to all our guests joining us online, especially our friends from Singapore and other parts of Southeast Asia. My name is Jin Tan from Curatorial Programs team at the National Gallery Singapore. And on behalf of the organizing team from Musée Cernuschi and National Gallery Singapore, I have the pleasure to welcome all of you to the Symposium Asian Artists in Paris, New Narratives. The symposium features research from 2 independently developed, though thematically related exhibitions. The first is Lefebvre, Mai-Thu Cao Dam, pioneer of modern Vietnamese art in France, held at Musée Cernuschi, which is currently on display at level 1 till 4th of May. And the second is City of Artists, Asian Artists in Paris, 1920s to 1940s, to be held at the National Gallery Singapore from 2nd April to 17 August. Today, you will hear from our curators from both institutions as they share their curatorial insights as well as discuss new research and concepts that these exhibitions have inspired. There will be introductory presentations on the two exhibitions and followed by two panel discussions and a roundtable conversation. We will have a 10 minutes break after the first panel discussion, and the symposium will be bilingual with simultaneous translations in English and French. And I should also highlight that there will be a second part of the symposium in Singapore later half of this year. And so please keep a lookout for more information online. And both parts are generously supported by our Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth of Singapore. So we now invite our lead curators of the two exhibitions and fourth chief curator in charge of Vietnam and Central Asia at Musée Cernuschi, and Phoebe Scott, Senior Curator and Curator of Research Publications at National Gallery Singapore, to share more about the exhibitions. And Phoebe, please.
Good afternoon to you all. I will quickly introduce the exhibition at the Cernuschi Museum. It's an exhibition which is a first because it's bringing together for the first time the works of the long career or the long careers of three artists that are considered pioneers of modern art or Vietnamese modern art, because all three were graduated from the first two classes of the fine arts school in Hanoi, in Indochina, the first fine art school in Vietnam or in Indochina. And it always makes sense to bring them together and show them together in exhibitions because all three decided to pursue their career in France. Cao Dam was the first to settle down in France. Definitely didn't know it would be definitive then. He graduated in 1931. He was the first in his class, and he got a scholarship to study in Paris. Lefebvre and Mai-Thu graduated from the first class too, so they studied between 1925 and 1930. And Lefebvre was the first of the three who came to Paris during the colonial exhibition of the World Fair in 1931, because he was working with Victor Tardieu, who was the director of the Fine Art School of Indochina, to help him organize the exhibition of the works of art from the school in the colonial exhibition in Vincennes, just outside of Paris. So he stayed there for a while in Paris, and then went back to Hanoi to teach drawing. That exhibition, the exhibition that you'll see, got the very important support from the children of the artist. They have a lot of sketches, archive, unpublished drawings and sketches, and shared a number of photographs that can give us more context at the time. Throughout the exhibition, there are more than 60 photographs that are being shown. Three parts in the exhibition. The first part, as you can see, is on the Indochina period of the three artists, with study drawings that enable us to have a look at the training that was provided in that fine art school, the École des Beaux-Arts in Indochina. So perspective drawing, anatomy drawing, and also more specific, or more specifically Asian media, silk painting, and lacquer. And lacquer will become true lacquer painting. In the second part of the Indochina section, we see how artists at the time were reasonably well supported by a state system that was very close politically to colonial political parties in France, supporting exhibitions, colonial exhibitions or fairs, where these artists can start being better known from Western audience. And at the very heart of the exhibition, we try to wonder why these three artists have decided to go to France and never return to Indochina. Two maybe possible answers. One is that their careers were quite narrow, if you like, in Indochina, because their clients were mostly Westerners, and they were also faced with quite a strict Confucian culture and society, and these artists were open to a certain class of literary people in Vietnam at the time. So they're certainly more open-minded. And in the second part of that small socio-economic focus, if you like, we'll have a look at the consequences of Second World War, because those three artists met in Paris or gathered in Paris in 1937. Cao Dam was in Paris in 1932 because he arrived in Paris at the end of 1931 thanks to a scholarship. And Lefebvre got a new job in 1937, there again to supervise the international the welfare that takes place in Paris. Mai-Thu had never been to Europe before, and he asks to get leave from his job as a drawing teacher and gets a scholarship to attend the World Fair in Paris. So in August 1937, all three are together in Paris. War breaks out quite rapidly after that, as the success was starting to come to them. And in 1940, Lefebvre and Mai-Thu joined the French army. They were separated from Cao Dam then until 1943. Since after they left the army, Lefebvre settled down in Nice, and Mai-Thu settled in Mâcon in Burgundy. And we know that they shared that they took part in a lot of exhibitions together in the south of France. And the last part of the exhibition, we follow the specific evolution of each of these artists throughout their career in France. And we see that Lefebvre, like Cao Dam in the 1950s, give up silk painting that they had started as early as 1937, as soon as they arrived in Paris. And they go back to oil painting in the 1950s. And Mai-Thu remains faithful throughout his career to that silk medium, which he also adopted in 1937. And as a conclusion to the exhibition, we try to go back to the choices of these three artists, since we see in the styles of Lefebvre and Cao Dam, they adopt a neo-impressionistic style. And so one sees that they are influenced by the works of Western artists that they know. They don't really place themselves into a sequence, if you like, art history. They adopt that impressionistic style, and they don't care whether they are being innovative or not, because it's a style that's been around for nearly a century. But they certainly keep referencing their original citizenship through a number of simple elements, stereotyped figures of young Vietnamese women, always young, always beautiful, that one can see throughout in their paintings until the end of their lives.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Et avant de commencer l'introduction sur l'exposition, je veux juste aussi ajouter mes plus grands
Good afternoon, everyone. And before I start, I want to thank Musée Cernuschi for having us this afternoon and sharing our exhibition. And now I'm going to continue in English. Sorry.
So thank you. Yes, it's really wonderful to have the opportunity today to share about our forthcoming exhibition, and I think it has many points in common with the exhibition presented by Anne at the moment, as well as the long history of exhibition making on Asian artists in Paris done by the Musée Cernuschi. So we have quite a large curatorial team. So with me are Lisa Horikawa and Heng. And back in Singapore holding the fort are our colleagues Roy Ng and Teo Hui Min. So we've been working together on this exhibition for some years. And it's an ambitious exhibition. The scale is quite large. We'll be presenting 230 artworks, including painting, sculpture, lacquerware, decorative arts, and a further 200 archives and archival images. We have around 50 different lenders to the exhibition, and one of our most generous supporters and lenders has indeed been the Musée Cernuschi as well. I wish I could acknowledge all of our lenders here, but since there's only 10 minutes in this presentation, I'm afraid I'll have to acknowledge them collectively. But works will be coming from both museum and private collections from France and also across Asia. In developing this exhibition, I think we must acknowledge that for certain countries, country-based research, there's already been an extraordinary depth of research about the activities of artists in Paris. So a substantial body of research exists, for instance, on Japanese artists in Paris, on Chinese artists in Paris, and now with the recent presentation at the Musée Cernuschi also on the Vietnamese group of artists in Paris. So in a sense, I think it's important to outline why we feel we're returning to this topic from a new point of view, a new narrative in the Singapore exhibition. And so for us, we feel that the contribution is to set these different bodies of research into a comparative perspective, alongside a number of artists from the larger field of countries across Asia and Southeast Asia. And through this comparative approach, to really see how these artists were responding to different facets of the art world in France in this period. How did they navigate the art world of Paris? Where were they situated? What were their activities like? So it's an exercise in comparativism and also to an extent in kind of remapping the art history of Paris in this period from the perspective of these Asian artists who were active there. We chose specifically to focus on the period of the 1920s to 1940s. So in French art history, this corresponds to the interwar period, which is a period with quite specific features of its own, and we might think of Art Deco, the apogee of colonialism through the colonial expositions, various other avant-garde art movements, but also the return to order, the return to kind of classical figurative art. So this has an identity already in French art. And interestingly, that identity already gives an intimation of the foreign. The term School of Paris was coined in this period, and it was coined specifically to refer to the strong presence of foreign artists active in Paris at this time. From the perspective of modern Asian art history, this is also a critical and interesting period. So the artists that we're looking at in City of Others were coming from places in Asia where modern art was already evolving on its own path, where there'd already been several waves of receptions and considerations of the encounter with European art, and where the institutions of modern art were already developing. So we take the point of view that in Paris, these artists tended to aspire to further their art practice or further their careers, but they were moving in and out of equally complex and cosmopolitan modernities elsewhere. So the approach of the show is to try to remap Paris based on the experiences of artists from Asia in its art world. And these artists were variously foreigners, sojourners, long-term migrants, workers, students, or in some cases, colonial subjects. So I think for the visitor encountering the exhibition, they might be surprised in the sense that it might not be the Paris that they expect or the art movements that they expect when thinking about the history of art in this city at that time, because it's a concentration of sites or interests or styles or experiences that were relevant to this particular cohort of artists. We've structured the exhibition based on the zones where Asian artists concentrated their activity, according to our research and the kind of existing bodies of research that have already been done. The exhibition focuses on where their works were prominently or frequently exhibited, and this begins to include a kind of interesting set of sites. So we open with the story of exchanges that took place in the workshops of the decorative arts and the role of Asian artists and workers in the making of Art Deco. We look at the nexus between modern art and the promotion of colonialism, something that's also come out in Anne's research over the path of Vietnamese artists to Paris. So looking at the expositions, the salon platforms, the gallery spaces that were dedicated to promoting the colonial idea, and as a result led to certain movements of artworks and artists into the city. We look also at the ongoing significance of salons and nationally themed exhibitions for these artists. And it's notable that for the Asian migrant artists coming to Paris, the primary sources attest that exhibiting at the salon in this period was still a very important kind of reference point or important achievement. And finally, we look at art that was informed by the texture and daily social life of being a migrant artist in Paris, and specifically looking at Asian artists who connected with the district of Montparnasse, which was such a kind of calling ground for artists from all over the world. So our title draws upon this idea of Paris as a city of others, the sense that this was a time of a very large migrant and foreign-born population in Paris, a very prominent group of active foreign artists across the board. The sense that it was a city in which one encountered the other. In this period, Paris was a point of contact for visitors and migrants from around the world. And artists arriving from Asia in this time would have encountered a growing migrant community of considerable diversity. And in fact, following World War I, according to the art historian Charles Green, the foreign residents of Paris grew from 5.3% of the population in 1921 to 9.2% of the population in 1931. So a huge growth in the idea of foreign populations. Artists arriving from Asia to Paris not only experienced the othering effects of making their way in a new city and culture, but also encountered other migrant populations who were equally unfamiliar with France and unfamiliar to each other. And in this environment, difference was brought into sharp relief. Culture was newly relativized. For some artists, it could be the occasion of rediscovering the cultures of their country of origin via a new perspective given by physical and conceptual distance, or even a kind of estrangement. And I think this is quite noticeable in the exhibition that we see here of the Vietnamese modern artists as well, that the experience of coming to Paris didn't necessarily make artists become more visibly or conspicuously French. Often it was the occasion for quite significant re-engagement with the culture of origin, but taking place from this kind of point of view of conceptual distance and physical distance. The exhibition then argues that, in general, the critical impact on the artists of their time in Paris was a kind of self-reflexivity about their place in the world, and at times a deliberate mobilization of this sense of difference. So, of course, as we know, Paris has an outsized presence in art history as well as in the popular imagination. And so I think it's a legitimate question to ask, why return to Paris, from the point of view of the National Gallery Singapore on the other side of the world? Why should we return to Paris and afford it this attention again? Especially when, many curators and art historians today have justifiably turned their efforts to looking at alternative sites and nodes of modernisms elsewhere that perhaps have received relatively less attention. But I think what we feel is that in presenting the roles and activities of artists from Asia in Paris, it's also a means of giving new presence and prominence to their experience. And I should say, I think that it's not an exhibition about art in Paris that's curated in Paris. It's really very much curated from the point of view of Southeast Asia, thinking about the situation of our museum and where we are in the world. So the permanent galleries of National Gallery Singapore are dedicated to the modern and contemporary art of Singapore and Southeast Asia. And it's from that perspective that our research on Paris has grown outwards. So I think that's very reflected in the decisions that we've made in how to present the exhibition curatorially. So I have some examples on the screen of the different artworks shown in various sections of the exhibition. I think for timeliness, I won't propose to go through those in detail, but just to kind of leave with this sense of an exhibition that is coming from our place of writing the artists of our region into the history of the city in a new way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne and Phoebe. Please remain as I introduce the first panel, the panelists for the first panel discussions. So we'd like to invite Horikawa Lisa, Senior Curator and Director of Curatorial and Collections at the National Gallery Singapore, to the front. And she will be sharing on her research on self-othering in Paris through case studies of artists from Taiwan and Korea. We will have Anne to further elaborate on her research on Lefebvre, Mai-Thu, Cao Dam, and Phoebe will be the panel for this will be the moderator for this panel. So there will be a Q&A session at the end of their presentations. For the participants who are joining us online, you can leave your questions in the comment section. So over to the panelists, please.
Thank you so much. So going more into detail than the short introduction that I gave of the exhibition earlier, I'd like to go back on the very central period, crucial period of the moment when these three artists meet in Paris, because it will have consequences of the style that they would develop from the 1940s on. And as Phoebe said just now, it is very interesting to see that through the style that they established in 1937, they try to reflect on how can one be a Vietnamese artist abroad in Paris. So the year 1937 is very important. You can see it on that first slide, where Mai-Thu, in an archive photograph that was taken in Vietnam, touches up the photograph and writes in ink "Hue Paris 37" with his initials, his monogram for Mai-Thu. So he senses that it's a very important moment, and with a lot of humor, he presents himself as a kind of a rally driver, a rally driver, showing that he's going on a big trip, he's making the big leap. We also need to say that in Vietnam, Mai-Thu and Lefebvre had a fixed salary because they were teaching drawing. Mai-Thu was teaching in a high school in Hue, and Lefebvre was at the Albert Sarraut lycée, and he was also teaching at the École des Beaux-Arts de l'Indochine, the Fine Arts School of Indochina. But when they arrive, when they leave for Paris, they have to give up on their salary. First, they take an unpaid leave, and one has seen in the archive a number of letters where they ask for that leave, for that unpaid leave to be continued. So one can see that as a moment when they give themselves, that moment they give themselves to see if the new style can be successful in Paris. Two self-portraits that are at the very beginning of the exhibition. They're very important. The one on the left will go to Singapore in April for the exhibition in Singapore, and they were painted in 1938. Probably at this, these artists have done very few self-portraits, and it seems that they have made self-portraits at important moments in their careers. you'll see that in the exhibition in the Chernisky Museum. Mai-Thu had done a self-portrait in oil when he was a student, and one can see that he has the same facial expression with one eyebrow raised, looking at the visitor or the viewer with a kind of questioning expression, trying to express the fact that yes, he's someone that, well, you need to understand what I want to say. They've just arrived in Paris. They've just settled down in Paris, and they have taken the decision to try to only live from their art. So they decide to give up on oil painting, which was their main medium in Indochina. We have a lot of letters from Victor Tardieu, who is praising the talent of Lefebvre and Mai-Thu for oil painting. And it's not by chance that in the colonial exhibition of 1931 in the Bois de Vincennes, just outside of Paris, it's only oil paintings that Mai-Thu and Lefebvre sent to Paris. Lefebvre was also using lacquer, but they all learned silk painting at the École des Beaux-Arts in Indochina. Just to focus on silk painting, which is very specific to the Vietnamese school, silk is, of course, an Asian material, but it's mounted on stiff cardboard so that it can be framed. And framing is very modern because silk in the Far East was always on rolls. So these silk paintings have a frame, and this certainly opening Asian, if you like, windows onto the world. And in these self-portrait, these artists show that they will start something new. A few archive photographs. Lefebvre arrives in 1937 to supervise the Indochina section of the World Fair in Paris. And Mai-Thu joins them in July since he gets a scholarship. It seems that they live together, maybe in Cao Dam's flat, Avenue de Saxe. Well, that's where letters were posted, if you like. So it's quite likely that Cao Dam, who'd been in Paris since 1931, hosted these artists, and he certainly played a part in the fact that these two friends decided to join him. One can imagine letters exchanged between Cao Dam, Mai-Thu, and Lefebvre. Lefebvre had been to Europe, and he saw Mai-Thu in the summer vacations in Indochina before they left for Paris, and so maybe that played a part too, and he could convince Mai-Thu that Lefebvre was the place to be in terms of artistic dynamism. We know that they've got neighboring studios in the Rue Bertillon. You can see that in the photograph in the middle. And the third person that you can see here is Renée Apriou, a young French woman that Cao Dam met in 1936 and that he marries in 1938 in August. And she certainly played a part in Cao Dam's decision to remain, to settle down in France. As Phoebe said, this Rue Alphonse Bertillon in the south of Paris, not far from Montparnasse. So these artists are part of that collective emulation, if you like, and artists coming from all over the globe. And the last photographs, all three of them in a suit, very, very trendy, very elegant, in front of a park, maybe the Jardin de Luxembourg. Two are reading the newspaper, and one's reading the newspaper over Cao Dam's shoulder, who's got this nonchalant look with a cigarette hanging from his lips. So they often stage themselves in their artistic photographs, and maybe they were photographs that they would give to potential clients or maybe to gallery owners to show their activity. But it seems that if one can speak of an inter-China school, it would be from that moment on, from 1938 until 1945, where there were a lot of exhibitions where all three artists exhibit together. The first notable exhibition, there's another one at the end of 1937, where one can find a newspaper, something written about these three artists exhibiting together. But this one was 1938 at the Agence économique de l'Indochine, so the Economic Agency of Indochina. It's a government agency created, funded at the beginning of the 20th century to link up industry owners and entrepreneurs who might want to venture in China. And Victor Tardieu, who is the head of the École des Beaux-Arts de l'Indochine, tries to change the statutes and the function of that agency to open a cultural dimension, if you like. And there was a salon, Rue La Boétie, not very far from here, will propose exhibitions from artists from Indochina. So the works of these artists who were studying, who had been graduated from the École des Beaux-Arts de l'Indochine, are being shown, and these students or graduate or students who graduated can send works, paintings and so forth to Paris, where they can be viewed and maybe sold. So Blanchard de la Brosse is at the head of that agency. He has ties with Indochina, and he writes to Victor Tardieu asking him to send more silk paintings, because originally the Economic Agency were proposing oil paintings, sculptures, and silk paintings. And it happens that silk paintings attract the Paris clientele, and a lot of sculptures or oil paintings, and a lot of sculptures and oil paintings are sold. So as early as 1931, from the accounts we have from the colonial exhibition, of course, all these works are for sale, and it certainly is the silk paintings that sell the best from the outset. So one can see there's a lot of appetite for French customers for silk paintings. The subjects covered by oil paintings are also Asian, but the medium is less attractive to French customers. So in 1937 and 1938, there's a radical change in the work and the works of these three painters. One can imagine that they consult each other because it's a very quick change. And from the very first exhibition, one sees, well, we can see Lefebvre in front of one of his paintings, and Cao Dam, so you can see above, and then the one on the top right in the photograph on the left is reproduced in color on the right, and we can see something very different to what they did in China. Very stylized faces from these young women, whereas earlier, be it in silk paintings or paintings, the massive shapes and quite realistic, even though they were simplified. But here, they are very elegant and very thin, and colors are also sharper. Cao Dam, when he graduated from the École des Beaux-Arts de l'Indochine in 1931, he was only a sculptor. He studied all techniques, but because of his specific skills, Victor Tardieu directed him towards sculpture. But in the 30s, the sculptures that he proposes for sale to the agency are not sold, and we have letters from Blanchard de la Brosse, who says, "Stop sending me sculptures," and Roche tries to convince Blanchard to stop sculpting because that doesn't sell. And when Cao Dam stays in Paris, he has a scholarship from at the beginning, but when the scholarship runs out, he needs to sell to remain in Paris. And in this photograph, which was taken during an exhibition in 1938 at the Economic Agency, we can see in the cabinets, one sees sculpture at the back. So Cao Dam has changed the way he sculpted in Indochina. He moved towards smaller sculptures in terracotta because they are easier to produce and so cheaper to sell. And these sculptures are quite interesting. Very few are dated. They're mostly dated around 1930 and 1940. It's not certain that he produced many more after 1940. But interesting because they directly echo his new silk painting style. So from 1933-34, one can see that he becomes a silk painter. So he gives up on the pressure of the economic agency and moves to silk painting to sell more works. But he proposes quite massive figures in very subdued tones. But he will then join a more colorful style in a very sudden way around 1937, 38. So one can be certain that he was influenced by the emulation that he felt with his friends. We can see a comparison that might be more telling. Self painting on the left, an oil painting in the middle, both produced in Indochina, and that new style invented from 1937-38. One can see that oil painting, even if it's the same medium, the same technique as on the left-hand side, the work is a completely different mannerism, grace, moving away from realism and introducing a form of something archaic in the composition because all characters are detached from one another. And he gives these figures certainly very manneristic gestures and the garment is the lausas, which is a modern garment, quite recent, that became popular in the 1930s in Vietnam. So he manages to formulate or to create Vietnamese paintings that are seen by customers as timeless Vietnamese paintings, but it's a dreamed or a recomposed Vietnam. But you can see the contrast between the painting on the left when he moves to silk painting in the 1930s, in 1940, once he adopts the style of his comrades. Same again. For Mai-Thu, on the left-hand side, we see an oil painting with a massive form, shape, and on the right-hand side, a very dreamlike landscape on silk with a couple of lovers. And 1938 and 1939 is also the last moment when works by the artists were bought by the state. 3 works on silk that one can see in the exhibition, and they correspond to the last purchases kept in the National Center of Visual Art. All 3 are silk paintings by 3 artists. After that moment, from after the outbreak of the war, the French state will stop supporting these artists. You can see that things are working well for these artists. They've found a new style. They take pictures, to publicize themselves, and the war breaks out in 1939. Lefebvre and Mai-Thu join the French army. They leave the army in Mâcon for Mai-Thu, and Lefebvre settles down in Nice. One can see on the right-hand side Lefebvre and Mai-Thu in Nice. They exhibit, they have a few shows together. In 1943, when Nice is occupied by Germans, they decide to go back to Paris, where he joined Cao Dam, who couldn't join the army because he was married and had a family. And finally, a comparison between the works of these three artists. You can see on the right-hand side, Mai-Thu keeps or remained faithful throughout his life to that silk style, if you like, very refined, that's been established in the late 30s. Lefebvre in the center and Cao Dam on the left will look at or will experiment differently. They're interested in the École de Paris research with a thick outline, dry brushes on the silk, so something quite different. And as a conclusion, I'd like to show that these artists were not isolated in Paris, because in the photograph on the top, you can see the first class of the students from the École des Beaux-Arts, with and on the right side you see Levende, who was who came out first from the first class, and because he was first of his class, he got a scholarship, and he was also the first student from that school to come to Paris, and we can see that on the. You can see Levende on the left, all 5 people sharing a meal. Levende was also in Paris in 1938, and he remained in Paris and in Rome, where he worked for the Vatican. And in 1937, he's in charge of the Vatican Pavilion for the World Fair. One knows that he met these artists, and maybe he played a part in the invention of that new silk style. And Levende became the head of the fine art school in Saigon, the École des Beaux-Arts, and that's the photograph on the right-hand side. So that style will have posterity through the Ferro Levende. And you can see here that Levende was painting on oil originally. It's a large oil painting that was exhibited in the Salon in 1933 that was bought by the French state.
Voici les peintures.
And here are Levende's silk paintings later on, so I can see you can see a lot of closeness between the Vietnamese Paris School and what happened in South Vietnam. Thank you.
It's okay. So we'll move directly now to the presentation by Lisa, and I'll be referring to the questions jointly at the end of the session. So for those online, please remember you can put questions into the chat, which we'll also bring up later. And I just cannot resist to move on before making a further plug for the exhibition in Singapore, which is that beautiful large Levende oil will also be traveling to Singapore for the show. Okay, so Lisa, please.
Continue. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll get right straight into my presentation. So the discussion on Japanese colonial period art had been perceived almost as a taboo in the immediate decades following the post-war independence for Taiwan and Korea. However, just taking the example of Taiwan, following the lifting of the martial law in 1987, pioneering efforts have been made by a group of researchers, and I would like to kind of mention specifically the name of Yan Zhuangyin, who has contributed so much to the research as a pioneering researcher, resulting in establishing a distinct field, scholarly field as Taiwan art history, inclusive of the Japanese colonial period. During the past 2 decades, several important exhibitions have been realized through the collaborations of museums, curators, and researchers in Taiwan, Korea, and South Korea, and Japan. These are some of the selected examples. There are more than these in the respective 3 locations. But just to name a few, the Taiwanese painting during the Japanese colonial era from 2006. At the center is a comprehensive historical survey of the official salon exhibitions organized by the Japanese colonial authority in Taiwan, Korea, and Manchuria. And lastly, the one on the farthest right is an exhibition that explored the activities of Korean and Japanese painters in the Korean Peninsula during the colonial period, held in 2015. So within this historiography of exhibitions on this topic, perhaps one area that requires further examination as a shared experiences between the artists of Taiwan and Korean artists during the Japanese colonial period is their activities in Paris, because they were here in a third place, I guess you could call it that, neither the colonial metropole of Tokyo or their respective places of origins. So our exhibition, City of Others, brings together the stories of Asian artists in Paris from the 1920s to 40s. And as Phoebe said, each of the artists coming from places where modern art was already evolving in its own path. We approach the artists through a comparative angle, focusing on their intersections with the different zones of practice that we have identified for them in Paris. But because Paris is a site of our investigation, and Paris being the capital of the sprawling, French colonialism or colonial empire then, although the exhibition will have a dedicated section examining deeply the complex relationship between the artists from French colonial empire vis-a-vis the French colonial propaganda, as well as the resistance in response to that, how Japan, as the only colonial power within Asia itself, affected the activities of Korean and Taiwanese artists coming to Paris is perhaps may not be brought to the fore in the framework of our exhibition in Singapore. So because of this, reflection on the limitations of the exhibitions, which I'm happy to admit. I will be focusing today's sharing on the Taiwan and Korean artists in Paris by looking specifically, I must admit that it's a preliminary findings on the common and divergent paths taken by these artists in their encounters with Paris. And as well as the highlighting the individual artistic strategy that some of the key artists forged under their inextricable influence of the Empire of Japan, despite being in Paris. And it's my hope that this small sharing, will provide an additional layer of context that may not be so readily visible in our exhibition itself, and yet it is a very critical subtext to the artists that we're featuring that cannot be forgotten and silenced. So this is an overview of the artists from Korea and Taiwan we are featuring. In the course of research, we identified about 10 or rather 9, sorry, we identified 5 artists from Taiwan and 4 artists from Korea as having been active in Paris during the period that we're looking at. But of these, the ones that are included in our exhibitions are 2 Korean and 3 Taiwan artists, starting with Pa Eun-sung with his sort of very impressionable self-portrait in the beginning preface of the exhibition, followed by a selection of 3 artists, Yan Shuilong from Taiwan, Lee Chong-woo from Korea, and Pa Eun-sung again from Korea, in the sites of exhibition, looking at the works that were either displayed in the salon exhibitions or works that are related to, in Paeun Son's case, the solo exhibition of his in Paris. And in the final section of the exhibition, we have 3 Taiwanese artists' works grouped together to sort of present their intimate relationship that they built in their everyday lives of Paris, but also the works related to their studio practice. By looking at the years, these 4 artists from Taiwan and Korea, 5 artists, 4 artists from Taiwan and Korea, excluding Paeun Son, because as you can see in the brackets, the period that he was in Paris was much later than the first 4 artists listed here. And in Paeun Son's case, he arrived to Paris after about 15 years of sojourn in Germany. So it was a very kind of exceptional case. But one could summarize that most of the artists' time, the Taiwanese and Korean artists' time in Paris, was found to be concentrated between the period of late 1920s to the early 30s. And this trend accords with those of the Japanese artists. I've shown here a table listing up the number of registered Japanese residents, which could also include those from Taiwan and Korea, that were compiled by the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And as you can see, the number sort of hikes, it hikes up in 1926 and it drops quite dramatically in the early 1930s. So maybe just to share a broader context in which the Korean and Taiwanese artists shared in coming to Paris. The 1920s for Japan was a period marked by Japan's post-World War I advancement as a global power and relative economic prosperity, despite the calamity of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. By this time, the gradual increase in the number of returning Paris-trained artists in Japan, and with it, bringing with them to Japan sort of almost contemporaneous information and inflow of information of the latest artistic practice in Paris with little time lags meant that for the Japanese artists aspiring to come to Paris, there were wider options that they could conceive. So no longer kind of tied to, the path is being study at École de Beaux-Arts, there was more options available to them. And this, no doubt, also affected and informed the artists that artists from Taiwan and Korea may have considered in coming to Paris. Of the 5 artists, excluding Paeun Son, all 4 of them studied in Japan prior to coming to Paris, establishing their connections within the Japanese art circles. And it was important that these artists came to Japan to study because at that time, the Japanese colonial government did not establish formal art schools in Taiwan or Korea. They had established a salon exhibition system in the 2 locales, 1922 and 27. But the incentive to establish those exhibitions was also partly to respond to the need of the Japanese artists living in Korea and Taiwan needing for, to have a platform to display the exhibition. So for any artists or students aspiring to become professional artists in Taiwan or Korea, it was critical for them to first come to Tokyo to receive formal training. And some of them, as the artists that we're including in this exhibition, further aspired to go to Paris. So how was the experience of the Taiwanese and the Korean artists working in Paris? How did they perceive their own identity? How were they perceived? The Taiwanese artist we're including in the show, Yan Sanlan's resident registration card in Paris indicates that he used the Japanese name Sasaburo Yo. He has signed his name to the left as such on the card. And in the catalog entry of his participation in the 1932 Salon du Tome, he is mentioned as born in Taiwan, in bracket Formosa, his nationality as Japanese. His residential address is listed as Foundation Japonais on 3 Boulevard Jodan, a location close to City University. I haven't been able to find much information on the Foundation Japonais, but I think it's safe to suggest that he found support from a Japanese organization that was available in Paris. In his unpublished diary from 1932, Yan Sanlan's aspiration, as well as sort of deep anxiety of living in Paris, hoping to find a breakthrough in the artistic expression, is very vividly and candidly painful, rather, written. The next two artists, Yi Chong-woo and Yan Shuilong, both shared the experience of having studied at the Tokyo School of Fine Arts. Here we have their graduating work. So at that time in the Tokyo University of the Arts, all students were required to make self-portraits upon graduation. Which is a great sort of collection that the university, the Tokyo University of the Arts has today. And here we see Yi Chong-woo dressed up in the Korean attire, and looking back, and his sort of background is presented in a very contrasting warm color, while for Yan Shuilong, he's dressed in a typical sort of school uniform that was used both in Japan and Taiwan, and he wears a coat above him, and in the background it's interesting that we see brush strokes that sort of suggest the connections to ink painting, perhaps a motif of willows, pine tree, and his signature on the left is written in a vertical orientation in, it could be either Japanese or Chinese characters, and I'll share the same characters, but added with the seal. In fact, sort of bringing out his connection and identification with the Eastern tradition. It could be to do with the fact that during this period in the 1920s in Japan, the resurgence of interest on Nanga painting or Southern school painting was taking place. So whether this sort of the signs hinting his resonance with the Eastern tradition had to do with the artistic sort of development shift that was happening in Japan, or his own sort of self-identification with the Chinese tradition is yet to be explored. Okay. Lee and Yan both entered the Salon du Tome. Lee, unlike the other Japanese or Korean students in Paris, he studied with a Russian artist, Vasily Shuvaev, which may explain the central motif in his still life with a doll exhibited at the Salon du Tome, sort of resembling a Russian Orthodox icon in a glass case. Interestingly, with this work, his signature is written in the Korean Hangul. While I'm unable to check the signature he used in the graduating work from Tokyo, it is interesting that in the work that was produced for French audience, he used the Korean letters marking his name. In contrast, for Yan Shuilong, this is a painting he made of the Montsouris Park, which again was quite close, I understand, to the Cité Université. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that Yan Sanlan's registration card was also hinted his physical proximity to Sita University. This is also another area that we could do further digging in future. In Yen's case, while the Eastern sort of quality of his painting was emphasized in his work from Japan, here we see him signing his name in Romanized, letters, using the Japanese pronunciation of his family name, and stylistically, I don't think there anything that sort of suggests overtly his Taiwanese identity from the painting itself, using the soft palette and a large color plane, in a post-impressionist style. One thing I wanted to also share with you all was that in the course of our research, so the work by Yen Shuilong we had just seen in the previous slide, it was also exhibited at the Salon du Temps of 1931, along with the works by these artists that you see here. So Liu Haisu, the founding principal of the Shanghai Art School, together with his pupil Liu Kang, who had close connections with Singapore Malaya growing up, who accompanied Liu Haisu in Paris, and as well as a Japanese artist, Noguchi Ataro. This is not to say that maybe these artists, knew each other or had direct exchanges, but I think it's important to highlight that there was a sharing of the time space in Paris across the artists coming from different parts of Asia. The last sort of figure that I want to zoom in very quickly is Pai Un-song, whom I mentioned earlier that he has spent 15 years in Germany before coming to Paris. He had produced 3 self-portraits during the 1930s. The work that we're showing in City of Others is the one on farthest left. And sorry that you can't really see the detail quite clearly, but behind him, him presenting himself as this professional artist wearing a white coat and holding a palette. On the wall behind him, you will see an image of a ukiyo-e-like print hang on the wall. And behind him, of course, is a kind of a typical sort of European street scene. So there's this juxtaposition of contrasting, elements coexisting in his painting. And again, we see that kind of contrasting existence happening in the second portrait, where on the left behind him, so in this one, he's presenting himself as a shaman or soldier, could be both. And on the left of him, we see what seems to be a scene of a festival from Korea, whereas on the right side, it's kind of a typical dancing hall, dance hall scene from Europe. And here, with Pai, the shaman becomes the connecting figure of the two worlds. Yeah. And on the right, behind him, a scholar, Shi Min-jong, has done an extensive work on Pai Un-song and has noted that the scene seems to resemble a Roman classic sort of architecture temple. So different, contrasting elements with Pai Un-song as almost like a spiritual figure, but also as a modern artist, references from, European classics, as well as the contemporary life, as well as, of course, the Korean tradition. So you can see that the different layers and very complex nodes of references that he had. Don't think I have time to go in detail about this, but just to highlight that Pai Un-song was the only Korean artist to be featured in the Japanese artist exhibition that was held in 1938 and 1939. And during the time when the public perception on Japan was rapidly deteriorating due to the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War. And this is the view of the exhibition. So far, we haven't been able to identify which work by him was exhibited, despite the existence of these photos. Pai Un-song was featured extensively in this Franco-Japan magazine that was published by the Franco-Japan Committee to improve, right, the the perception of Japan overseas. It was a form of a propaganda magazine. And Pai Song's illustrations are used repeatedly. And I just wanted to highlight that it's quite visible that oftentimes his drawings, illustrations that are used feature children, right? And I think it's partly perhaps to do with the Japan's desire to present itself as a benevolent colonial ruler, and sort of the amicable image that he was trying to present through Pai Song. But he was a very accomplished artist on his own. This is a work that he exhibited at the Salon of the National Society of Fine Arts, where we see him connecting with the very sort of the canon of the snowscape scenes in ink painting, but using oil and this very kind of flat layer surface. And his reference to ukiyo-e, I think, is also evident from the composition of the tree at the forefront. Okay, this is my last slide. Okay. Despite the fact that Pai Song was mobilized and his time in Paris happened to be or was precisely during that period when the Japanese desire to advance and improve its outward image in Paris became important, and he was, I think, you could say, that useful tool for that purpose. But in the exhibition the solo exhibition that he had in Paris, which was supported by the ambassador, Japanese ambassador to Paris, and in the review of that exhibition, we see a French critic talking about the complexity of Pai's practice. You can see in here that he's kind of encouraging people to see beyond his cultural identity as a Korean artist, acknowledging his strong connection to the European tradition, rather. So I think it's very hard to sort of summarize the extent of the Taiwanese and the Korean artists, and I think it's an area that needs much further research. But I hope that through our exhibition, the cross comparative look on not only of the Taiwanese and the Korean artists in Paris become apparent, but also vis-a-vis the artists coming from other parts of Asia, and leads to further research in future. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much to both presenters. How much time do we have for questions? Okay. So I have managed to work out how to use the question platform. I was a bit nervous because at first I thought I just seemed to be giving myself a lot of thumbs up emojis by mistake. So if you see a lot of enthusiasm, I was actually trying to access the questions. I think, okay, so so there's some interesting questions coming through on the chat, which I might frame as part of a larger question to connect Anne and Lisa's presentation at first. So we have a question on the chat about where France Japan magazine was published. But I think this could be answered as part of a larger question, which is the idea of the networks of support to bring artists to Paris. Because what's interesting across both presentations is that for Vietnamese artists coming from Indochina to Paris, there is a colonial network of support to kind of promote the work, to bring the artists to exhibit the work. And interestingly, same for the artists coming from Korea, from Taiwan, there's also the Japanese colonial network that somehow places significance on having these artists study abroad and exhibit in Paris. So maybe in answering about the magazine, you might also like to give a bit more detail about, why these networks exist and what did they do for the artist.
must apologize. I have to look up my sources to answer that question precisely. As far as I know, I think it was published in Paris, but I can share more details. And as I mentioned during my presentation, scholars like Shin Mi-jung and Kim Megum have done extensive scholarship on Pyeonjong and Pyeonsong, and I have learned tremendously from their research. In terms of the support system for Taiwanese artists, one artist that I couldn't share because of the time limitation we had was Yan Shuilong, and how he managed to sustain his time or coming to Paris. So he had a benefactor. He had a strong sponsorship from a Taiwanese, a very influential figure from near his hometown. And his son, who was also studying in Paris, was a very close friend of him, and they would frequently, visit each other and welcome sometimes Japanese authors and cultural figures coming to Paris. So I think it was quite varied. It was not uniform. So in some cases, they received support from their sponsors back home. Some cases, I think, as I mentioned, by this time in the 1920s, the means of how artists sustained in Paris was quite diverse, or at least for Japanese artists. And some of them were here on a self-funded stay. Yeah. So I think it was quite varied for each of them.
À propos du
In terms of support for these artists, for artists from Indochina, the best support from the outset is Victor Tardieu. Victor Tardieu is very much trying to put his network for the diffusion, the dissemination of these the works of these artists, including in France, and he helps these artists to move outside, to leave that pro-colonial channels, if you like. And of course, there are colonial obedience articles, if you like, in the press in the 1930s, but not only. And people that are not pro-colonial would be interested in these artists as early as the 1930s. And there was a commission from, there was in the 1930s, there's a commission by the university, by the Cité Universitaire in Paris, or residence hall in Paris, for the Indochina house in that cité. And so a large painting was commissioned. It was painted by Lefebvre in 1930. And at the time, it was the first painting from the École des Beaux-Arts to be seen by French reviewers. And it's seen outside of colonial networks. And reviewers, the critics, enjoyed that painting. And the painting was shown in the Salon des Artistes Français, the Salon of French Artists, which was a major salon at the time. So Tardieu was very much trying to make sure that there was that pro-colonial network, so propaganda support, if you like, but there's also that concern and that desire to present these artists in other domains so that they can free themselves from these pro-colonial networks.
Also ask a question? Yeah, okay, perhaps can we pass the microphone back?
Hello, thank you for these presentations. I was just wondering why the numbers of the Japanese and Korean artists dropped after the 30s.
It's because of the economy. Yeah, the worsening situation overall. Yeah.
There's another question from sorry.
And it drops again even further after 1938 with the outbreak of the war. And yeah.
Another question from the chat relates to what was the interaction between artists from these countries in Asia and other countries in different parts of Asia. And I think actually it's something we struggled with in the research for City of Others. You know, in fact, the sense of lateral connections was quite rare, and maybe it's because of different languages or different networks. But I wondered if, you know, in the research that you have on these particular collectives of artists, what do you see about interactions with artists from other parts of Asia, Chinese artists, for example?
Yeah, this has been a challenge, right? Because we started our research hoping to find signs of that. We have, based on research that's done by a Japanese scholar, Wada Hirohumi, have found article published in Japanese art magazine writing about Chinese artists in Paris. Like Liu Haisu is mentioned in the article and will be presenting the article in the exhibition. But immediate sort of references, I mean, in case of the Taiwanese and Korean artists in Paris, of course, they're interacted with the Japanese artists and their participation in the Japanese artist exhibitions. For some of them, also tell that. But beyond that, we have not been able to find sort of concrete record.
Yeah, so I was framing the question in a more general way, but the questioner, Francesca Dal Lago, would like to ask, she asked whether there's any interaction between Chinese artists and Chinese artists from Taiwan that you observed in your research.
There has been a lot of research done on this by the Taiwanese scholars, looking at some of the Taiwanese, artists from this period, they would also, go to mainland China for study and also for their practice as well. So I haven't been able to identify a concrete source that attests to the exchange that the Taiwanese artists in Paris had with the Chinese mainland, artists in Paris. But that kind of exchange would exist back in, between Taiwan and mainland China back then. So I would think that the exchanges could have also happened in Paris as well. And for this, I would strongly sort of suggest you to refer to the sources of the compilation of the primary documents published by Yan Zhuangying, Professor Yan Zhuangying, and it could have sources relating to the exchanges between China and Taiwanese artists, at least back in Asia.
Well, we're out of time, so I'll take one more question from the chat, because I think for the people in the room, we can have a more of a chance to discuss in our upcoming break. But this question is for Anne, and the question is, we don't seem to see any paintings of, for instance, Cao Dam's wife, Renee. And so often the Vietnamese artists seem to concentrate their painting on Vietnamese women, where many artists do paint their wives as a convenient model. So have you noticed any such paintings, or what's your view of this?
Portrait his wife, Renée Apriou, but we wouldn't pick the few I know who are a representation of his wife, because it's quite rare, and I think they were more in. Oh, pardon, je parle en anglais.
Sorry, I was sorry. I was speaking French. I was speaking English, so I continue in French. So we couldn't. I didn't choose these rare representations of the of Cao Dam's wife, and I have the feeling that the theme of Cao Dam's and his compatriots was very much a dreamed Vietnam. We know a few portraits for Mai-Thu from the Macon period, around 1940, when he made portraits of the Macon bourgeoisie to make a living, because he was in dire straits. but he very quickly stopped. As soon as he was offered other exhibitions, he stopped for these portraits. We also know a few portraits by Lefebvre, but clearly that's not what they wanted. So Cao Dam produced a few portraits of his wife, but he didn't see her as an artistic muse. She was his muse in his life, but not in his artistic quest, if you like.
This session there for now, and I understand.
Thank you, Anne, Phoebe, and Lisa for your sharing. So we'll take a 10 minutes break. So we'll come back at 3:10 p.m. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. So now, please welcome Chai Heng, Senior Curator and Lead Curator of Heng at National Gallery Singapore, to share her research on Chinese modern art, focusing on Chinese artists who studied in France and from the mid-1920s to the Sino-Japanese War period. And for Phoebe, we'll also be joining this panel discussion to share on her research on modern lacquer between art and industry, Paris and Hanoi. And this panel will be moderated by Anne, and we will be taking in questions at the end of the presentations. So to the panelists, please.
Okay, so go ahead to begin first. No? Okay. So what I'd like to present today is some new research directions. Partly they'll be reflected in the City of Others exhibition, and partly some of what I'm presenting today is kind of new research that will go beyond the exhibition as well. And in summary, what I want to discuss is how modern lacquer, which had sites of production in Paris as part of Art Deco and in Hanoi as a modern painting movement, how these two sites were connected. And they were connected not just by the circulation of stylistic ideas and influences, but also connected by the circulation of the skilled workers and artisans in the field of lacquer, a working class cohort who moved from Vietnam, sometimes directly from the villages where traditional Vietnamese lacquer production was based, to Paris and back again. So I think that by looking anew at this cohort of workers, it can help to challenge our ideas about the movement of style or concept or techniques in modernism, which moved not only along privileged circuits of education or art publications or educational institutions, but with a know-how and experience that travels with people. So an important setting for this question is the general popularity of lacquer in Paris and especially within the Art Deco movement. Of course, the popularity of lacquer, the lacquer material in France has a much longer-term history, dating back to the 18th century and even before, when East Asian lacquer processes inspired the development of substitute techniques in varnishing to try to capture the glossy and impermeable finish of lacquer. By the 20th century, the movement of artists and artisans directly from Asia to Paris, either to exhibit at world expositions or work in the ateliers of decorative arts, meant that it became possible in Paris to work directly using natural lacquer material and according to the kinds of processes that had developed in East and Southeast Asia. And it was the popularity of the lacquer aesthetic which also supported the market for this kind of production. So here on the screen, we have examples of the work of the Japanese artist, Sugawara Seizo, who worked in collaboration in Paris with the designer Eileen Gray. The two joined forces in 1910 and had a productive business together in Paris until around 1927. While on the other side of the screen, a 6-panel lacquer by Hamanaka Katsu, a Japanese artist who arrived in Paris in 1924. And interestingly, he arrived with no previous experience in working in lacquer, and he took up the skill in Paris because of the popularity of the market for the material. He subsequently built up his own business of innovative work in lacquerware. He was trained initially by Sugawara Seizo. He built up his own business in lacquerware, furnishings, and screens, very well received at the time. His work even appeared on the cover of the magazine L'Illustration in 1937, and he ran his own atelier with a group of workers. But perhaps the best known and most preeminent lacquer atelier of the period was that of Jean Dunand, the Swiss-born artist and designer. Dunand initially specialized in denandery, but also learnt the rudiments of lacquer technique from Seizo Sugawara in 1912. And his atelier became well known for large-scale, experimental and innovative treatments in lacquer and a wide variety of different types of wares. So here we can see, for example, vases with different lacquered patina treatments, Art Deco-style geometric lacquered jewelry, including a cuff-style bracelet that was worn by the dancer Josephine Baker, and an immense 12-panel screen with a forest scene. But while Sugawara is often credited with Dunand's initial education in lacquer, the two didn't collaborate or go into partnership. And in fact, Dunand's lacquer production did not increase until after World War I, and he began to show more ambitious lacquer works more extensively in salons and gallery presentations in the 1920s. In fact, this coincided with the expansion of his Vietnamese workforce. So one of the things I'd like to suggest today is that this workforce constitutes a very important factor in the development of his lacquer production and his success. What we know of this workforce exists only in quite limited traces. Dunand first started working with Vietnamese lacquerers during World War I, when they were recruited to trial industrial uses of lacquer to prepare aeroplanes for combat, applying natural lacquer to the airplane wings to make them more weather-resistant and impermeable. Dunand helped to establish and manage the initial workshop where this took place. Subsequently, he also began to employ Vietnamese artisans directly in his atelier in the post-war years. So these images, one of them comes from the archives of the Dunand family, showing a Madame Nam using the technique of eggshell inlay, and another also of an artisan posing eggshell for the lacquer inlay from the archives of Roger Villers. In these three cases, we can see work that's both manual, requiring a large, potentially unskilled workforce, such as the polishing of the airplane wing, but also highly skilled and extremely specialized, requiring someone who has a depth of knowledge and very particular skill. Thinking about the production of luxury furniture and objects in lacquer as it took place as a craft process in Vietnam, it's noticeable that it relied not only in artisans skilled in working the lacquer itself, but also on workers active in a number of other highly specialized skills, such as wood carvers, specialists in inlay, specialists in making the pigments that could mix with lacquer, specialists in hammering of the gold leaf. Villages in the northern rural areas of Vietnam, the provinces of Hà Nam, Nam Dinh, Bac Ninh, and especially the village of Dinh Bang, Hà Đông, as well as in the environs of Hanoi, were dedicated to the array of specialized skills, of the production of very specific items that were needed to make a finished lacquer product. So in that sense, lacquer was produced less by an individual artist than by a network of practitioners with different skill sets. The artisans who worked on mother-of-pearl inlaid furniture, for which North Vietnam was well known, might have used this skill in the intricate placement of slivers of cut shell to create the geometric eggshell inlay work, which became one of the signature techniques of the Dunand Maison. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the quotation. So this is another kind of rare trace, is this article about Dunand published in 1926, where someone describes a visit to the atelier. And part of what they describe, it's only a small part of an otherwise long article, is seeing the Vietnamese lacquerers placing the eggshell into the surface of the lacquer work. As well as innovative designs in eggshell and other decorative techniques, Dunand was also engaged in the making of lacquer panels on an immense scale. He was commissioned for lacquer panel decorations for the luxury ocean liners L'Atlantique in 1930 and the Normandy in 1935. And his atelier had to be reorganized to accommodate the extraordinary scale of this work. He also created new techniques for working in lacquer to make it more durable and suitable for this form of large-scale decoration. So Dunand is an artist who didn't particularly follow the existing processes of lacquer work, but was actually innovating to be able to produce at scale and for the market as well. But an interesting source suggests that this work was also supported, importantly, by Vietnamese workers in the atelier. An article by Hamanaka Katsu, published in 1933, comments that Dunant assigned the work for L'Atlantique to a Vietnamese artisan in the atelier. But of course, Hamanaka is not a particularly reliable source here, as he himself was very bitter about having lost that same Atlantique commission. Nonetheless, it does suggest a certain level of responsibility that these artisans had in the atelier to be able to be given this sort of large-scale commission work. So who were the artisans working for Dunant? And it is very difficult to find out. And in fact, the sources on these artisans appear in a very unusual place, which is the archive of SLOTFOM, or the Service de Liaison avec les Originaires des Territoires Français d'Outre-mer. It's really a mouthful even in French. But it's a security service which kept a very close watch on the activities of any colonial subjects who were moving to France. And these archives can be extremely detailed because they were for political purposes. So based on these archives, it's possible to know quite a lot about who lacquer artists met, how they met each other, where they went on a day-to-day basis, who knew who, what their politics were, what someone said to someone on some day in 1930, but almost impossible to know anything about what they produced in the lacquer ateliers. So it's maybe a very frustrating archive for an art historian, but also quite a fascinating one in terms of finally uncovering the names of some of these people who are contributing to this development. So this branch of the French security services rigorously documented the activities of immigrants from the colonies in Paris, suspicious to the point of paranoia regarding their potential for anti-colonial politics. The mutual aid associations formed by lacquerers in Paris were the targets of Sûreté's surveillance, and it appears that they often did have a political character. The working class of Vietnamese laborers in Paris were considered ideal grounds for leftist radicalization. So in fact, there are a number of undercover informants posing as lacquerers, or maybe they actually were lacquerers and reporting on their fellow lacquerers. So reports made by the informants to the Sûreté show that the Association des Lacqueurs Anamites, or the Association of Annamese Lacquers, had a goal of moral and material support for the fight for independence. So they were considered one of the most politicized groups of migrant workers in Paris. So that is where this list comes from. And Dunant was requested in 1930 to provide a list of all the Vietnamese workers in his atelier. And that's why in this one instance, we find ourselves with their names, their date of birth, and their point of origin. And there's some very interesting things that can be learned from this list. So one thing we can see, I've highlighted this one because Dinh Bang is the kind of traditional heartland of Vietnamese lacquer production. It's known as the lacquer village. But many of these other villages are also from this northern or Hanoi environs area that was a lacquer-producing region of Vietnam. We can also see, there's some variation in the dates of birth. You can see some of the workers are not young, which I think also suggests that they were being employed for a very specialized kind of skill. Down here, this name here, Tran Dinh Nam, also has a file of his own in the security services. And this also gives a stronger sense of the individual trajectory of what one of these lacquerers could be like. So according to his dossier, he came to France in 1916, engaged for World War I as one of the kind of colonial, when you sign up for the army? Engagé. Yeah. You know what I mean, yeah. Engaged to participate in World War I. And then he worked for Dunant from 1923 to 1939 until the studio closed because of the impending World War II. His dossier also describes him as having had, quote, well-recognized artistic qualities and having received important designations, including being named an officer of the Academy of the International Exposition of 1937, where he also received a Diploma of Honor, and a bronze medal at the International Colonial Exposition of 1931. Also apparent from the SLOTFOM archives is that all other kinds of small businesses run by Vietnamese lacquerers also existed, not just working for the kind of larger workshops, but also some Vietnamese artisans broke out on their own to run their own businesses producing lacquer. In fact, according to the historian Charles Keith, 1/4 of all of the Indo-Chinese migrants in Paris in 1929 were working as lacquerers, so it was a huge industry. But this term, I should say, this encompasses also quite industrial uses of the medium. So not everyone was making Art Deco style chaise longue, like some of this was really very industrial uses of the lacquer material. And once again, we can learn a lot about these businesses and their histories from the slot form archives. So for instance, here we have a beautiful Art Deco style business card from the lacquerer Din Van. And it turns out his full name was Din Van Phung. He came from a family of lacquerers in Ha Dong, in the north of Vietnam near to Hanoi. He came to France in 1918 during World War I to work as a lacquerer. And at the end of the war, he received permission to stay in France. And he joined employment in a society called the Society for the Expansion of France in the Far East, which was a lacquer studio that grew out of the wartime lacquering activities. Later, he settled in Montmartre. He became married to a French woman, and leading up to the Exposition Coloniale of 1931, he allegedly became engaged in a number of anti-colonial political organizations. Because he was an exhibitor at the 1931 exposition, he had access to the exposition grounds. So he was accused of giving access to anti-colonial activists to distribute tracts and leaflets, polemics against the exposition during the period. However, at his request for French citizenship in 1934, by that time he ran his own lacquer business in Boulogne-sur-Seine, and he was cleared of anti-French leanings. So this is a significant insight into the lives of these artisans. But again, very little documentation exists of the kind of work they undertook. And for those who worked for Dunant, perhaps the products of the Dunant atelier are our only clue. So I want to turn now to a different circulation, which was the way in which the lacquer art and artisanal products being made in Hanoi were also circulated and exhibited in Paris. So one very important initial platform for this was the landmark 1925 International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts. It was, of course, a major showcase for cutting-edge architecture and design, featuring thousands of exhibitors, including some pavilions that were dedicated to Asia. Of course, in the colonial setting, the Pavilion of Indochina, representing the Indo-Chinese colonies, was commissioned by French colonial administration. And it took the form of a richly appointed house, decorated with labor-intensive and intricate examples of Vietnamese craft practice. The contribution from Tonkin, North Vietnam, was designed by the Hanoi-based French artist Marcel Bernanos and was in the form of a dining room. And of course, the Art Deco quintessential showpiece, a fumoir. So you can see here the central hall, some of the lacquered furniture, which is actually described as being red and black lacquered divan, which also has some more modern stylization, kind of simplification of form, and then the opening of this lacquer fumoir. For the furniture and the lacquer work, the 1925 catalogue identified all of the individual artisans, and these are all names now that don't figure in the history of kind of modern Vietnamese lacquer painting, but they were considered accomplished enough at the time to have been offered this prestigious showcase. If the 1925 exposition represents a high watermark of the public display of artisanal work, by 1931, examples of the modern lacquer painting movement from Hanoi had also made their public debut in Paris. So I won't go into much more detail about the modern lacquer movement in Hanoi, because I think it's been covered by what Anne has presented about the curriculum of the École des Beaux-Arts de l'Indochine, which aimed to kind of localize forms of modern art and looked at local materials such as lacquer as a way of expressing a kind of uniquely Vietnamese modern aesthetic. At the 1931 International Colonial Exposition, some early attempts in this direction were shown for the first time. So this is the setting of the exposition itself, a huge showcase of colonialism, particularly French colonialism, but in fact featured the colonial powers from around the world, in which colonial nations displayed their empires by means of pavilions of indigenous architecture, or often pastiches of indigenous architecture. For Indochina, the centerpiece of the display was a close to life-size version of the Khmer temple of Angkor Wat. So in this image, we are actually looking at this reconstruction of Angkor Wat in Paris. And the exhibition of Vietnamese modern art was one of many exhibitions dedicated to activities within the colonies that were featured inside this building. So this is quite an a rare image of the interior where we can see an early lacquer painting that's actually been mounted almost like a decorative panel or interior design panel onto the wall of a lacquer salon. And the students of the school designed this lacquer furniture as well as creating these new style paintings that were mounted on the wall. So Lefebvre, one of the artists featured in the exhibition here at the Cernuschi, was one of the artists to experiment early on with this material. And we can see from the image that was published in the exposition catalogue, his early lacquers were quite geometric style landscapes on a screen format, also partway between decorative items and painting. And this work, I believe, was not shown in Paris, but I'm bringing it out because this work is no longer, or its location is no longer known, whereas this work shows some very similar aesthetic qualities and kind of reflects the almost Art Deco-like, slightly Japanese aesthetic in Lefebvre's early lacquer at this time. And interestingly, Lefebvre's studies for lacquer panels similarly show this circulation between Art Deco, kind of geometric, slightly Japanese stylization, and the growing lacquer movement in Hanoi. Presentations continued at the 1937 Exhibition of Arts and Techniques of Modern Life in Paris. This exhibition was dedicated to applied arts, techniques, and artisanry with a specifically more commercial orientation. But while elsewhere the 1937 exposition highlighted up-to-the-minute examples of industry and design, the section dedicated to the colonies was somewhat predictable because once again, we see this pavilion of faux Angkor Wat was used to represent Indochina. Alongside this pavilion was a streetscape of boutiques in which lacquerers, embroiderers, etc. plied their trade in view of the visiting public. There are actually interesting existing archives about how artisans were recruited to come to this exposition. So in fact, they were recruited by a public call in Hanoi to all of the kind of small traders and small businesses in the city. And the artisans who eventually accepted the invitation included a lace maker, a basket maker, a horn and ivory carver, a maker of votive objects, and several weavers. The selected artisans were invited to travel to Paris, but they had very specific requirements that they had to fulfill. They had to practice their crafts on site in front of the public during the exposition. They had to wear traditional dress. They had to sleep in situ at the exposition site, and they were only permitted to leave during fixed hours. The artist Lefebvre was selected to accompany the artisans as their guide and interpreter, chosen because he spoke very good French and he had previous experience at an exposition in Paris. And as Victor Tardieu attested on his behalf, Lefebvre was also capable of organizing the exhibition of art from the École des Beaux-Arts de l'Indochine, which would be inside the tower of the Indochina section. The two lacquerers who traveled to the exposition also were associated with the École des Beaux-Arts de l'Indochine, rather than being kind of the small traders of Hanoi. One was the recent graduate Nguyen Cang, who had studied at the school, and the other was Din Van Tang, an artisan from the Dinh Bang lacquer village, who had also been very supportive in establishing the early research into lacquer at the Indochina School of Fine Arts. So this is an image, I'm sorry I didn't put the source, but it's published in a Vietnamese art history book by Quang Viet and Quang Phong. It shows an image of the two of them at the lacquer boutique at the exhibition, surrounded by lacquer paintings, panels, and boxes, giving their live demonstration of lacquer. However, the image hides a miserable reality. It was technically impossible to produce lacquer paintings, which require very specific conditions of humidity and temperature, in the makeshift and dusty exposition studios in Paris. Nguyen Cang was forced to leave many of his planned works incomplete, and worse still, on his return to Hanoi, he found that he owed a considerable debt to the exposition administration for the cost of his working materials. But the archives show that his debt was forgiven, and he was considered to have borne up very well in the circumstances. Meanwhile, Dinh Van Tang is always presented as an artisanal figure in this story, a helper rather than an artist. But what's interesting is he's often presented as kind of representative of the Vietnamese craft tradition, coming directly from the lacquer village. But here we find him, an image of him, in Paris in 1937 at the sort of peak of lacquer modernity as well. So one of the interesting features of Nguyen Cang's work is that he tended to have a strong interest in folk tales and folk motifs, which was quite unusual in the period. And his paintings came to Paris to be exhibited at the Indochina Economic Agency. And despite the issues with his visit as a live demonstrator of lacquer in 1937, it did possibly have one interesting impact, which it seems like it's very likely that he met Jean Dunand during this 1937 period. And on his return to Hanoi, his technique in lacquer and some of the ways he approaches the stylization of form, the use of kind of relief-based lacquer, is very different to his previous work. So it's possible that this encounter with Art Deco directly did help to kind of frame his work in a new way. But in any case, Art Deco, and especially the work of Jean Dunand, was quite well known in Hanoi and circulated via other means. So for instance, I've seen a Vietnamese review where someone is looking in great detail at the lacquer panels that Dunand had produced for some of the steamships and commenting on their aesthetics and their technique. So this information was also circulated by other means. And an interesting case is that of Pham Hao. Pham Hao was born in Dong Nhac, which was also one of the artisanal villages near to Hanoi, traditionally known for its handicrafts and painting. From 1929 to 1934, he studied at the Indochina School of Fine Arts and then opened his own studio. He specialized in lacquer, and he was really known as the kind of master of technique. So it was felt in Hanoi at the time that perhaps he wasn't the most expressively artistic, but he had the strongest decorative technique, which you can see. I mean, unfortunately, it doesn't reproduce well on a slide, but there is, an extraordinary variety of technique and subtle use of color and form in this particular work. So he's not known to have ever been in Paris, and I don't believe this work was exhibited in Paris. But there's a very strong connection to Art Deco aesthetics, and including the work of Dunand. So we can see on the other side of the screen, this is a fumoir produced by Dunand for the 1937 exposition, where it was a showpiece, and it has very similar structure of stacking square panels, quite an unusual way to produce the lacquer, as well as some similarities in the way the motif is treated. So in looking at these different circulations, my proposal is to look at kind of the way that different ideas circulate within modernity. Vietnamese modernity in Hanoi was distinctive, but also connected to trends that were developing elsewhere. And this took place not only through the movement of images or ideas or educators, but also the movement of artisans occupying quite a different strata of society. And then finally, I want to leave you with a very poetic work on exactly this subject by the contemporary artist Phan Thanh Nguyen, whose experimental practice often makes fictionalized and poetic meditations on aspects of Vietnamese history. So her own engagement with Vietnamese lacquer led to a series called Magical Bows, Lacquered Time. And in fact, the pieces are a direct reference to the making of the airplane wings in Paris during World War I. So the piece is in many ways a sort of quite poetic homage to that generation of artisans. Each bow in the work is a repurposed wooden crossbow from the Central Highlands, carrying over the idea of the weaponized lacquer of the airplane, as well as referring to a Vietnamese tale relating to a magical bow. And they're each meticulously rendered in different forms of lacquer and inlaid treatment. So it's a lovely kind of poetic way to revive, in a way, the history of these workers whose work is otherwise quite difficult to identify. Okay, thank you.
Hello. Okay, good afternoon. First, before my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the collaborative efforts of our curatorial team in uncovering Georgia Chen's archives. So today I'm going to share some findings from Georgia Chen, a prominent woman artist of Singapore, from her archives, but also try to extend to the bigger picture, which surfaced through our exhibition as well. So Georgia Chen, just give a brief introduction. Georgia Chen, born in 1906 in Zhejiang, China, and passed away in 1993 in Singapore, was a prominent artist. She moved to Singapore in 1953 after living in Paris, Shanghai, New York, and Penang of Malaysia. Chen's artistic journey has long been framed within Singapore's art history, notably highlighted in her retrospective exhibition in 1985, organized by Singapore National Museum as part of the Pioneer Artists of Singapore series. However, her identity extends beyond this. In 1988, the Taipei Fine Arts Museum's exhibition, China Paris, 7 Chinese painters who studied in France, 1918 to 1960, positioned her among the second generation of Chinese artists who studied in Paris in the early 20th century, marking one of the first instances linking her to the modern Chinese art history. Yet her early career in France and China remains underexplored. In this presentation, I will examine Chen's early career during the Paris period, 1920s to 1930s, while addressing a few key questions within the broad discourse of modern Chinese art in a global context. How can Chen's overlooked role in Chinese artistic modality be repositioned? To what extent does her work engage with the themes and tensions of the discourse? And how can we better understand the discourse of Chinese art in a global context? Okay, so this is a little bit background about Chen. Chen was born into a wealthy family of business and culture elites in Zhejiang. Her father, Zhang Jinjiang, a successful businessman and a key political figure in the Chinese Nationalist Party, a key patron supporting Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek. He founded Tong Yin Company in Paris in 1902, exporting Chinese goods to the West. His influence and connections shaped Chen's transnational upbringings. As reported by the Shanghai Eastern Times in 1926, which I put here, she was raised in Europe, fluent in English and French, and educated at Shanghai's Matai School before pursuing art education in France via a brief study in the US. Chen's time at the Art Student Leagues in New York remains unclear, but she moved to Paris in 1927, studied at the Académie Flores and taking private lessons. She lived there until 1938, except for a break from 1931 to 1933, when she accompanied her husband, diplomat Eugene Chen, traveling between China and France, with significant time spent in Shanghai. In her oral history interview, Chen recalled studying under Russian painter Viktor Podolsky in Shanghai, learning foundational drawings and painting techniques. This detail, often overlooked, and reminds me her possible ties to the Shanghai art scene. Archival records show that Podolsky's work was featured as early as 1922 in Shanghai newspapers. According to newspaper Shenbao, the Shanghai Academy appointed him as a professor in the Western art department in 1925 to elevate its Western art standard. A Russian refugee who settled in Shanghai after the 1997 revolution, Podolsky became an active figure in the Shanghai art scene. Okay, this is the Podolsky's studio at the French Concession near the Bonn. Okay. Running a studio in French Concession and gained recognition for its mastery of realist oil painting. Interestingly, I found that Chen listed the Shanghai Academy as an educational institution in her 1954 Singapore teacher registration form, despite she never really officially studied there. This suggests her connection to Shanghai's art world was through exiled Russian artist Podolsky. highlighting the city's cosmopolitan scene during the 1920s. So here I would like to introduce a side notes responding to Lisa, the question just now. Actually, Shanghai is another cosmopolitan site which has a lot of influx and interactions between the artists from Asia, from Japan, and all over the world, as we can see in this particular case. Chen's time in France is often viewed simply as a period of apprenticeship in Western art. The surviving example of her works from this period seems to confirm these narratives, as she demonstrated her ability to a certain extent to master Western techniques of representation across different subjects. As reflected in her work, her studies range from naturalism to early modernism. A 1930 Salon review praised her skills, observation of value and perspective in her initial presentation at the 1930 Salon d'Automne. This is the work, but the original lost. A closer look reveals more about Chen's learning journey in Paris. She encountered diverse artistic currents and art schools. In response, she adopted a balanced approach, private classes, classical lessons for technical discipline, and free studios like the academic Flores to develop her ability to construct holistic images. Her 1935 diary surfaced her mental friend relationship with Charles Alexandre Picard Ledoux, her teacher at Flores. Together with their spouse, they took a 4-month painting trip to Provence in 1935. Some of Chen's work from this trip, originally shown in her 1936 solo exhibitions, will feature in the City of Others exhibition. These newly discovered works, as seen in the slide, clearly show Chen's stylistic homage to Cezanne, engaging with his favorite motifs of rocks, trees, and the landscape around Aix-en-Provence and the Chantenoy. What drew me most attention is Chen's mentor Picard's work. I'm showing at this side, highlighted in yellow. His Provence landscape and village scenes. While Chen's art is inspired by Cezanne, her connection to Picard is stronger. Picard, who trained at the Académie Julia and was active in the Montmartre art scene in the early 20th century, was closely associated with prominent artists such as Suzanne Valadon and her son, Maurice Utreau. Picard's work reflects an eclectic approach to modernism, distinct from Cezanne's analytical and structured use of color patterns, which construct volume and depth to create a self-contained pictorial world. In contrast, Picard's modernist approach represents a synthesis of realism and modernist elements drawn from Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, simplifying color tones while employing broader, loose brush strokes and maintaining a closer connection to the nature representation. This approach profoundly influenced Chen's pictorial language. Moreover, Picard's figure modeling and the use of naturalistic color convey a sense of the formal simplicity and solidity, aligning with the return to order movement that gained prominence. Next slide, please. In the post-World War I France, this movement emerged as a reaction against perceived excess of avant-garde modernism, such as Cubism and Futurism, calling for a revival of classical traditions in art. It emphasized clarity, balance, and structure, often drawn inspiration from Renaissance and neoclassical art, and celebrate themes of rural labor and timeless stability. Picard's The Farm with the Rabbit, selected for the City of Others exhibition, and in the center of the slide, exemplified this ethos. Similarly, Chen's depiction of farmers at work, as shown in early slides, reflect this artistic revivalism. The resonance between Picasso's and Chen's work suggests that Chen's synthesis of realism and modernist expression align with broader currents in the interwar French art, shaped by her direct engagement with Picasso. Her mentorship under Picasso often offered insights into the nuanced learning experience of Chinese students in France. A parallel example is Xu Beihong's training under the Yuan, right? As researched by Philippe Sinequin, Chen's case highlights the pivotal role in intermediary figures in guiding Chinese artists through the complex terrain of Western art canons, while also accommodating their negation of diverse range of artistic currents. This is an area of modern Chinese art history that remains underexplored. Forgive me, I drink some water first. I'm very thirsty. Unlike San Yu and Pang Xunqing, who abandoned formal academic training to explore modernist individuality, Chen's education at the free schools in Montparnasse reflects an alternative and perhaps more common approach. In the diverse artistic environment of the French art world, Chinese students encounter a range of influences, with academic realism and modernism often existing in dialogue with a more fluid dynamic. This experience was likely shared by many Chinese artists in Paris during the interwar period of 1920s and 1930s. As Philippe Sinequin notes, at the National Academy of Fine Arts, modernist influences was absorbed gradually and selectively. While the tension between realism and modernism is often central to the narrative of modern Chinese art history, typically framed as the debate between figures such as Xu Beihong and Liu Haisu. This dichotomy may not have been a primary concern for Chinese artists in Paris, a point I will revisit later. Next. A further investigation in Chen's time in Paris suggests that she may have begun experimenting with Chinese theme subjects around 1935. During the 1935 to 1936 Salon and her solo exhibition, Lynette, the next one. She presented works depicting Chinese scenes. One particular intriguing piece from this period is Dancer, which was selected for 1936 Salon of National Academy of Fine Arts. The painting features a European ballerina at the center of the composition, seated at a long table resembling traditional Chinese furniture, with an Asian folding screen in the background, elements that may have been drawn from Chen's own home, as mentioned in her 1935 diary. The piece incorporates elements of Art Deco style, with its clean lines and stylized form, alongside traditional Chinese motifs. Rather than being a deliberate act of self-orientalization, Dancer reflects Chen's early attempt to engage with both Chinese and Western aesthetic elements, perhaps realizing the limitation of this experiment and the potential of misinterpretation. Chen never revisits such themes in her later work. Next. Landscape, created during her 1935 trip to Provence, was exhibited in 1936 Women Artists of Europe exhibition at the June Dupont, and later acquired by the museum, and now is part of the Centre Pompidou collection. In this Cezanne-inspired landscape, the color patches in the foreground echo the old master's technique, though Chen does not follow Cezanne's disciplined method for a cohesive image. Her brushstrokes soften in the middle ground, painted in shade of blue to depict the sea, while the distant mountains are rendered in a style reminiscent of Chinese ink and wash 渲染 method, traditionally used to depict mountains. Although Chen was not formally trained in Chinese painting, she had a foundational understanding of the tradition, including painting and calligraphy influenced by her father and the cultural environment of her family. I have included other works by Chen alongside with works by Picard and Zezon for a visual, more direct visual comparison. This is George's another work, and this is her teacher, Picard, and this, of course, is a Zezon. So we can see very clearly how they deal with the distant background, the mountains, right? As seen in New Territory by Georgette, her brushstrokes convey the volume and tonal variations of mountains from a Western perspective. Therefore, the blending of Chinese and Western methods in the work landscape further demonstrates Chen's intention and her early exploration of Chinese themes and aesthetics, even during her time in France. Okay, next one. So this is some rare document we discovered in recent years about Georgia Chen. Actually, she's able to write in Chinese calligraphy quite well. And this is her father, Zhang Jingqiang's work. Okay. So although there is no document evidence confirming Georgia Chen's interaction with other Chinese artists in France, aside from Liu Kang, who later migrated to Singapore as well, an artistic connection can be seen between Georgia and other Chinese artists' work. This is particularly evident when we comparing Chen's work to that of Chang Shu-hong. Okay. Who arrived in Paris in the same year as Georgia Chen and later studied at the National Academy of Fine Arts. Chang deliberately integrated Chinese elements into his oil paintings, as exemplified in Melody of Nostalgia, where he incorporates iconographical reference to Chinese culture traditions. Similarly, in Sisters, the peony pattern backdrop reflects his engagement with Chinese traditional motifs, while also revealing the influence of Art Deco aesthetics. Furthermore, in Portrait of Shana, now in the Pompidou collection, Chang employs inwash rendering techniques, reminding us the Chinese gongbi, the meticulous star painting. Beyond his vigorous academic realism, Chang's work also display. Next one. Chang's work, this we can see the standard he's able to achieve through the lengthy training in the French academies in both Lyon and in Côte d'Ivoire, right? Yeah. Okay, so this is the work. Sorry, this is the work now in Pompidou collection, painting his daughter. So Chen employs, beyond his vigorous academic realism, as we can see here, Chang's work also displays a more expressive dimension, as seen in The Sick Lady, which adopts a free, more emotive approach. Now this belongs to Lyon Fine Arts collection. The experience of Georgia Chen, Chang Shu-hong, and other artists, though beyond the full scope of this presentation, highlight a crucial tension faced by Chinese artists in Paris. Modernity for them was not simply a choice between realism and modernism, as might be framed within the local context of China. Rather, it was a complex process of constructing a distinctively Chinese contemporary art within a globalized world they inhabited. Immersed in Paris' international context, these artists grappled with the challenge of positioning Chinese art within a transnational framework. For the artists trained in Western techniques, this process entails not only mastering a foreign media, but also culturally internalize them, thereby enable them to both affirm and negotiate their own artistic identity and concerns. The 1933 Chinese Contemporary Art Exhibition held at Musée Dupont stands as a concentrated reflection of the issue discussed above. Due to the ethnographical curatorial approach of the museum, combined with the complex background surrounding Xu Beihong's role in organizing this show, the contemporary section predominantly showcased traditional ink painting, excluding works in other media. Paul Very's remarks in the foreword are particularly thought-provoking. as he acknowledged that young Chinese artists have inherited both Chinese and Western traditions. However, he highlights the significant gap between the two and questions how this profound dissonance might be resolved. While offering encouragement and hope, he also expressed concern about the inherent difficulty of this task. After the exhibition, Chang Shu-hong, the oil painter we showed just now, having viewed acquired Chinese works in the museum permanent display of Chinese art, published his review in a Shanghai newspaper, Minbao. He noted that, aside from the continuation of great traditional legacy, there were no few works that embodied the spirit of modernity and contemporary China. This critique likely reflects the perspective of an oil painter grappling with the urgency of addressing this issue. It is noteworthy, as confirmed in Georgia Chen's early biographical note, that the curator of the exhibition and director of the Musée Cernuschi, André Desois, was acquainted with Georgia Chen and had acquired her work following the European Women's Exhibition, most probably the work Landscape, which I have discussed earlier in the presentation. Chen also mentioned that she received encouragement from Desois to create works reflecting modern Chinese themes. This episode once again underscored the shared and urgent task by young Chinese artists, highlighting the ongoing process of conceiving and constructing modern Chinese art within the platform of international dialogue and exchange. Okay, as the conclusion notes, as we conclude this presentation, it is crucial to recognize that artists like Chang Shu-hong, along with other Chinese artists who studied in France, were largely unable to continue their artistic exploration within an international context due to the war and subsequent ideological isolation. Georgia Chen, however, was among the few exceptions. Upon her return to China in the late 1930s, she continued to travel and paint in southern regions, further deepening her engagement with local teams. Her exhibition in Shanghai during the 1940s, followed by later exhibition in New York, positioned her as one of the rare Chinese modern artists who maintained a connection with the global art scene during that period. In contrast, most of her contemporaries experienced significant disruption in their artistic practice, with many giving up oil painting or shifting their focus to wartime propaganda. When Chen relocated to Singapore in 1953, her artistic identity involved becoming integrated into the art historical narrative of her adopted country. Nevertheless, a consistent theme throughout her career spanning Paris, Shanghai, and Southeast Asia was her persistent effort to negotiate and assert a culturally subjective perspective. This perspective, while shaped by global conditions, ultimately manifested in her work as an effort to decentralize the inherent authority of Western media, historically associated with the center of Western art, by embedding it within a regional and culturally specific modernist context. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Tsai Heng et
Thank you so much, Chai Hang and Phoebe. Are there questions in the hall to Phoebe or Chai Hang about Vietnamese lacquers or Georgette Chen?
oui.
Hello again. What I was wondering, because we're talking about all these artists, but also these tendencies coming to Paris, was that very unique at that time? Meaning, did any of these tendencies or any of not any, but overall, was there a migration of these cultural notions going to other cities in the world? For instance, New York, London, or some other city?
I mean, I think yes. I mean, there's a migration between many different kind of networks of cities within the modern. I guess the reason why we chose to concentrate on Paris was that because of Indochina, there is kind of directly a colonial link. So the kind of passage is very concentrated in that era from Southeast Asia. But generally speaking, there was also, I think, an aspiration, even in the parts of Southeast Asia that were outside the French Empire, that coming to Paris was a kind of proving ground or testing ground. And I think that situation recurs in other cases in East Asia as well. So that was why for this exhibition, we thought it's meaningful in this period to concentrate in Paris. It doesn't mean that there was no exchange of modernity elsewhere. In fact, there was. And over time, these nodes and kind of hubs also shift as well.
Just add a little bit in. I'm unable to elaborate in just now the presentation, as Shanghai is very obviously is a cosmopolitan city in the East Asia already. And the Western techniques and other influences are able to be learned or seen there. But there is a early trajectory, which is Chinese artists go to Tokyo, Japan, then go to Paris. But in the 1930s, it became a circle. They realize it's a globalized world. It's not this kind of single trajectory. Yeah.
Thank you. I have. It's not a question. It's more a commentary from the net. Someone in the public do not agree on the fact that Chang Shuhong abandoned or let go his negotiation with modernity once back in China. Do you have something?
Can you explain again?
Okay. Do you have a comment on that? I do not agree on the fact that Chang Shuhong abandoned or let go his negotiation with modernity once back in China.
Okay. No, just now my emphasis is they abandoned or gave up that kind of exploration with imagination and understanding about the global art landscape. Because one, he back with the subsequent war, which driven them all go to the Sino-Japanese, war propaganda. And eventually, because isolation, the closing of the China. Yeah, so the focus of modernity is really become very specific within certain kind of restrictions. Let's put very specifically, which is socialist realism. How you deal with the modernism, you learn with the dynamic of socialist realism. Yeah. So I just want to elaborate. Yeah. But the early imagination about globalization, global art world, is no more valid for them to a large extent. Maybe it is still in the behind of somebody's imagination, such as Wu Guanzhong, as underlying dynamics, but it's not a dominant issue for them to deal with. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Est-ce que quelqu'un d'autre dans la salle aurait...
Are there any other questions in the room?
Quite a general question about the City of Others exhibition. What was the reason behind the selection of Kanai Itakura's work for the main visual, actually, of the all presentation?
Well, maybe Lisa can add more, but I think there were a few reasons. One is that just visually, it's quite a striking image to express an artist making a modern assertion of themselves. So there's something recognizable about both Paris and the idea of someone coming from Asia and modernity in that single image. We're also conscious that I guess there has been a large body of research on Asian artists in Paris that has focused on certain figures. And Fujita is the prime example. Of course, Fujita appears in our exhibition, but we thought maybe it's time that, in the way we put the exhibition out, we should try to highlight other artists who are here as well and highlight some additional trajectories. Is there more that you'd like to say on that, Lisa?
I echo you that Itakura Kanae is probably not the topmost name, of Japanese artists in Paris that come to everyone's mind. But reassessment of his work has been done in Japan. There was a solo exhibition of Itakura Kanae recently done in Chiba, and actually there's a really in-depth body of research that has been done, and I really wanted to kind of surprise the audiences for this exhibition by seeing new faces of not yet unknown Japanese artists, who are active in Paris.
Voilà, une dernière question sur cette présentation.
Maybe one last question on this presentation.
Inspired by the question of the different cities that could especially attract artists during this period. Because when thinking about Chinese artists, I see major figures like Xu Beihong or Lin Fengmian. They all did a travel, very important travel from Paris to Berlin, and so I wonder if for other artists coming from other parts of Asia, did they experience this travel to Berlin, and was it important for them?
Yes, Payon-sung. So in Lisa's presentation, actually Payon-sung spent most of his European career in Berlin, not in Paris. So we have some work from his Paris period and what he exhibited there, but the training was already done in Berlin. So I think it's a good point. And of course, throughout the exhibition, we can also see that artists move in and out of Paris as part of a European tour. Maybe it's a stop on their trajectory. So there's, of course, a broader context, another network of cities that could equally be mapped as well.
Merci beaucoup. Nous allons donc.
Thank you very much. We're going to close this this presentation here, and now moving on to the roundtable.
All right. Thanks so much, Phoebe, Taehoon, and Anne, for the wonderful sharing. So please remain for the roundtable. Please remain for the roundtable discussion. And I will also now like to invite Lisa, Eric, Mael, Bellec, Chief Curator in charge of Chinese and Korean collections at Musée Cernuschi, and the moderator of this session, Patrick Flores, Chief Curator of National Gallery Singapore, to the front for the roundtable discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a challenge to moderate this roundtable of so many good speakers, and but I'll try to navigate this roundtable. As an art historian and curator, I'm interested in, of course, we were fascinated with the researches as well as findings on the subject matter, but I'm also interested in like a framework, to develop a framework on this research, or a framework that emerges from this research. So, because we have limited time for this roundtable, I pose some questions to specific speakers. The first one, well, I'm interested, for instance, in this idea of the School of Paris, which I think will be complicated by the exhibition in Singapore, and I think was already complicated here in Paris. Also, the idea of Asian modernism, I think, is important. What does it mean? And if we see shows like this in Paris and in Singapore, maybe we can complicate a bit what Asian modernism is through a new entry point, which is in the role of Paris in the production of the modern in Asia. The idea also of the migration of art and the diaspora of artists. I think this is important subject matter to reflect on. And then finally, the question of this dynamic between alterity on the one hand, like otherness, and identity on the other, which is referenced by the self, right? The subjectivity of the self. So, which is, I think, central in the exhibition in Singapore, as revealed by the title "City of Others." So, for Mael and Eric, I have a question on the role of Southeast Asia in the context of the Asiatic imagination or Asian imagination in this particular museum. So I'm interested in how you imagine Southeast Asia to be part of like a broader Asian context, because I think we were talking about it last night, and you said that Southeast Asia is not really a dominant presence in the museum. But now that you have an exhibition on Southeast Asia, so how does it like? What is the relationship between Southeast Asia within a larger Asian context, and also the temporal marker, which is interwar? I don't know if how that temporal context also feeds into the discourse of Asia in this museum. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Patrick. So it's interesting because, of course, like every museum, our identity is mainly based on the collection, then, of course, on the exhibitions. And for many reasons, but the first reason is the founder, Cernuschi himself, who did a major trip in all Asia. He mainly collected objects in Japan and China. And for the second part of his trip, he just collected many photographs, but no objects from Southeast Asia and India. And that was very important for the development of this museum, who remained based on Japanese and Chinese collection, and later developed the Vietnamese collection, and then the Korean collection. And the Vietnamese collection is very important because it took place during this special period you just mentioned, which is the interwar period. And it was mainly based on what fascinated the curators of this period, which was the early appearance of civilization in Asia. And so archaeology was really the core of their interests. And so this was also, this is something important. And strangely, they were also trying to find some links between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia through those archaeological surveys during this period, and also with this colonial background, which also played a role in the interpretation of the findings in this period. So, and also strangely, also as during this period, we had so many artists coming to France, but the museum only started to collect and exhibit their works just after the war. So there is something very interesting, is that they are already here in France, but their work is only taken into account just after the war, but then it's been done very seriously, and also very interestingly, it's been done with the artists themselves. They are both exhibited in exhibition, but they also act as curators, counselors, editors, and many other aspects. Maybe that's kind of.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah. Thank you. So Mael, would you like to add? Yeah.
Does it work? Yeah, it does. I'm not sure it would be an answer to your question, but I think there's something which should be remembered, is that for all the artists who were there, they had to deal with redefining their identities. And they had to deal with that both by relying on what they were taught before coming to France, what they were taught in France, but also on the way people in France perceived them. And for a lot of French people at the time, Asian culture was kind of a blurry world. I mean, they knew Japanese culture quite well, they knew Chinese culture, but when it comes to Vietnam, before the colonial exhibitions, I'm not sure they had a very clear view of what Vietnamese culture could be. When it comes to Korea, I'm not sure they had a clear view of what Korea could be 20 years ago. And that means that a lot of these artists were seen not necessarily as Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean, but as Asian as a whole sometimes. And it's clear that some of them, even later on, were kind of fitted in the same category, even though they came from different backgrounds. And this is something which should be taken into account, I think. Another thing is that you were talking about different cities where these meetings could happen. Well, Southeast Asia was also one of these parts of the world where these artists could meet. And there's a French writer who published a book called Asian Mediterranean Sea a few years ago. And his idea is that Asia was kind of a hub and a kind of a network between different cities. And that in some ways, people in Shanghai had more links with people in Hanoi in the 30s than they had with people in Chengdu in some way. And that there were a lot of relationships which were established by the sea. And that there were some artists traveling from, for example, we have some works which are quite interesting because they were given to the museum by someone whose father was working in Vietnam. And he had some Chinese paintings because he organized an exhibition of Chinese painters in Hanoi.
I also would like emphasize that during this period between the two world wars, Indo-Chinese paintings were considered as French art. So when the government or city-state bought some paintings, they were exposed at the Musée du Luxembourg, as it is the case with the great Lefebvre oil painting you are going to present in your next exhibition. And it was bought to be exhibited in the Musée du Luxembourg, was dedicated to French artists. So they didn't have the same, they were recognized as French from Indochina. So they didn't share the same view as other painters, artists from other parts of Asia either.
Lumped together as I hope the view of Southeast Asia has changed. But I have the second question is for Phoebe and Anne. I think much has been said about the need to recover the agency of the Southeast Asian artists in the context of their labor in Paris. What I'm interested in is the agency of the material, which in your case, in your researches, would pertain to silk and lacquer. So I'm interested, this is not an easy question, but I'm interested in what made, as material, as agency, right? What made silk and lacquer so attractive, independent of the Orientalism? Based on your reflection on the study of material, what was it about silk and lacquer that drew people to them?
Actually, there's quite good evidence, I feel, about this, because if you look at, apart from, as you say, the sort of Orientalist Art Deco market for lacquer. But apart from that, in Hanoi, when the lacquer movement is developing, you can see in the Vietnamese text the way that people wrote about lacquer was very materially driven. The agency of the material was very strong. So it wasn't only that it had a certain kind of local aesthetic or national symbolism, it was because it could do certain things as a material. And that included things like its remarkable kind of surface effect, or the effect of adding multiple layers, or the sort of malleability of the lacquer to be able to kind of respond to different ways of representing. And one of the most interesting cases of this is Nguyen Gia Chi, who was the sort of considered the most prominent artistic lacquerer in the 1930s and remained a lacquerer for all his life. And one of the best sources about his work is a book of his utterances recorded by one of his kind of close collaborators and informal students. And in these utterances, in some ways, it's almost impossible to approach by means of conventional art history because the factual material is very low, but what is extremely prominent is the agency of the lacquer material. You know, everything he says relates to what lacquer calls him to do. I mean, he almost sees it as a living medium. So I think this is a very interesting question. I guess in my presentation today, I didn't focus on this aspect because I feel there's also a sort of underrated sense of the kind of economic labor of lacquer as just really hard work that requires a huge workforce. But of course, from the artist's point of view, the agency of the material is very strong.
What about silk, Anne? Do you have some thoughts on why silk is so like potent and attractive?
I suppose it's the way the Indochina School of Fine Art in Hanoi treated the way to apply color, watercolor on silk. So it is a particular technique which was not really taken from Japan or China. It was invented in the Fine Art School of Indochina in Hanoi, and it is said that it was due to a mistake of the famous painter Nguyen Phan Chan. They were adopted silk because they wanted to have that Asian taste, and also they remodeled the material, so they pasted it on a board to be able to rigidify it and to be able to frame it. So they used the framework as in a Western tradition, with all the idea behind of a window to another world. So for them, it was a very modern idea to frame a painting. And also, so this mistake by Nguyen Phan Chan, he tried to erase some mistake, and so he had to wash the surface of the silk, but he didn't erase the mistake because it's not easy. But the layer of colors became very smooth, and it is lustrous. It has a glow like satin, and they appreciate that. And I think the customers also appreciate that. Themselves as Vietnamese artists did enjoy the effect, and also in Paris at the moment they put their works on display. Everything was available at the colonial exhibition in 31, but it was the silk painting were the most attractive to customers. So they sold Nguyen Phan Chan was the painter from that school who sold the most of the paintings there.
Okay, please.
When you read art critiques from the 20s and 30s, there's something which is very obvious, is that when the paintings are oil paintings or are using a Western style, they are most of the time seen as lacking something. You know, they are like Western style painting, but not as good as French painting in some way. Whereas when the artists use other materials, the basis on which to judge the paintings is different.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I have a quick follow-up on that point. I was wondering if, because of the attractiveness of lacquer and silk, if that kind of painting changed the theory of painting in the West?
Still could.
Yeah, because it's like, I mean, yeah. I mean, like was there like a theoretical contribution that was elicited through this use of different materials? So just something that I think about as an art historian, so that we create a different art history or art theory based on the agency of material. But anyway, maybe that research has yet to happen, or that thinking has yet to develop, but I just put it out there for some reference. My last question for Chai-Hung and Lisa, has something to do with the effort to pluralize, right? Pluralize Paris, pluralize modernism, also to pluralize Asia, to make it more, the process between, let us say, Paris and Southeast Asia, more reciprocal, more multi-directional. So I was wondering how you would characterize this new condition, where there is, more interaction, more dynamic interaction between sides, right? How would you, if there's a young art historian who would like to study this condition, what would be the category of analysis? What do you describe it? Is it like cosmopolitan space? Is it like you mentioned, Lisa, the third space? Is it the beginnings of the global, or is it international? How would you, because we have moved away from the binary of empire and colony, right? Or local and international, because we created this active field already. So how would you, as art historian, what category would you propose? The idea of the third space would be, I think, productive. Yes, because I worry that the thinking just would be stuck in the binary if we don't offer a new category. That's the worry that I have. That's why I'm interested in this proposition. It's a propositional question. Yeah.
I think as we always be perceived like a dichotomy between modern and realism in Chinese context, right? But that actually become quite regional. And if we're looking at all the cosmopolitan circulations for those artists, we realize the key concern, the gravity is about, how to present the modern and contemporary related to their self within this platform, rather than those very concentrated dichotomy, which is more related to, in very specific, could be the professional competition like Shi Beihong and Liu Haishu, could be different art schools competition, specific and regional. But more question is within this global circulation, there is a multiple, dynamic, very fluid, and happen at the simultaneous at the different places, to thinking about the self, to thinking about how to present the self, to identify the validity of self within this globalization. And it could be come up with different aspects. Yeah, it won't be very fixed as like Georgia's cases. People have multiple imagination of self and self-representation in different contexts. And it's continually in a dynamic motion, in responding to that. Yeah.
I mean, Diane has very eloquently put it, but I guess it's difficult for me to categorize it with the concrete word at this point. But in the course of research for this exhibition, I didn't get to talk about the Japanese artists, but many of them, just a few years, later of their time in Paris, would come to Southeast Asia and have engagements with the local artists or the cultural propaganda, and it's the dichotomy or dichotomous view of situating Japanese art history between Japan and West has been so dominant. And I'm sure you know this, Patrick, from your number of engagements with the Japanese art history, projects in the past. But it's really not. It doesn't have. It's not effective. But I cannot negate the fact that the power dynamics definitely existed, and the colonial dynamics and the colonial gaze was existed, which has there remains a space for that to still be recovered. I don't think it's past issue. Yeah.
Like it's a good point to remind us that in spite of the intense interaction, right, between sides, we should not lose sight of colonialism as a force. Although I think also in light of new research of this intense interaction, we should also see colonialism maybe in a more complex way. Yeah. So I think on that note, we can open the floor for questions if you have. I don't see any question here, or maybe I'm not doing it correctly. But anyway, anyone from the room, please? Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. I found them all fascinating. I wanted to ask, and perhaps this question is more with the NGS exhibition, since it's a larger scale and you have a larger team, and the research sounds quite comprehensive. But I was wondering, how can we understand the world in which these artists were moving? And perhaps this has to, this is follow up with Patrick's question. And in terms of going beyond thinking about them as Asian artists, or, having, I'm also wondering what were the interactions with other communities of artists in Paris, for example, right? Because if we're thinking about Paris as one node in a global world of circulation, like Shanghai, or thinking about the influence of certain French artists on Georgette Chen, for example. I'm wondering more broadly, how did the presence of these Asian artists change the understanding of modern art in Paris? And maybe it didn't. But also, how did their interaction with artists who came from elsewhere also influence their work? Can we think about it perhaps through exhibitions? Or I imagine, when they were at these schools, that they, had friends and, they saw each other's work. Like, did your research touch on that?
Thank you for that question. And I think there's many sort of large questions within that. So maybe I'll go through a bit one by one. But the reason we foregrounded the title as City of Others instead of Asian Artists in Paris is exactly for this reason, that in coming there, it was a diverse community of migrants who came from all different places, including other parts of the colonies. And I think it was difficult for us to kind of map that in a comprehensive fashion in the exhibition, but we have intimations of that reality here and there. And you can see it in some of the works that the artists made that feature, people of different communities or races. we included some contextual works by French artists, but also by other migrant artists in Paris. So we'll have an example of Wilfredo Lam from his Paris period. So we try to mark that by certain kind of moments in the exhibition to kind of show that, of course, it's not purely an interaction between Asia and Paris. It's an interaction at this kind of very interesting meeting site. And indeed, the whole idea of the School of Paris was not generated around Asian artists. It was generated by other communities of foreign artists in Paris. So I think we try to gesture to that as best we can. And I mean, on another publicity note, we hope to include more material about that in our follow-up symposium, which will be held in Singapore towards the conclusion of the exhibition, where we'll also be looking at research from speakers kind of outside of Asia and Southeast Asia who've also been kind of tracking these kind of interactions in Paris. And I think the other part of your question was to do with the receptions in Paris and exhibitions. And actually, because of the way our exhibition is structured, we are proposing quite a lot of material that relates to exhibition sites and reception. So one part of the exhibition in particular is to do with the different exhibition platforms and what they were. Heng in her presentation highlighted the Jeu de Paume exhibitions, which is very interesting because this museum in this interwar period was specifically tasked with presenting the work of contemporary foreign schools. It was a museum of foreign modernism, including it showed kind of survey exhibitions of Japanese and Chinese art. But they were also very particular, and they were catering to kind of very particular ideas about what should be presented in Paris. So in a way, I think there is a reception where we can see a kind of critical response to from the audience in Paris of the period of kind of perceiving another modernity or perceiving a modernity from elsewhere in the world. I guess reception is always difficult to capture in exhibition format, so we've done that as best we can through some kind of archival trace. And in our catalogue, we've also kind of anthologized some parts of that reception, so they're kind of be able to surface it more explicitly. So I think that covers most of what you asked. Lisa, Heng, would you like to add? No? Okay.
I think I saw one more question. Yeah.
Thank you for yet another very enriching conference in this auditorium. And it was very interesting to learn about Vietnamese art and Asian art in this historical context. So therefore my question is, what is your vision for the development in the future of Vietnamese art? And do you see the movement moving beyond this period of history and sort of to the next generations of artists?
I mean, I think there are so many talented artists in Vietnam, and I wouldn't kind of dare to presume to say what the movement should be. I mean, I feel there's many. Since the period of the Indochina School, there have been generation after generation of brilliant and talented artists in Vietnam. So I think that's probably all I can say about that. Yeah.
Other questions? There's this comment from... Okay, please.
I don't know if the question is pertinent, but I was wondering, in regards to your very first question to the panel, Patrick, what is really the identity of Southeast Asia, right? How that has changed when the term itself started to be used, and in terms of this museum, of course, it's an older museum, so the focusing on this would come possibly later, and perhaps to tie it in, I don't know if I'm being clear, but perhaps to tie it in, would such visiting or moving of artists from Southeast Asia to other cities in Europe, and then perhaps going back or not, does that create a tie amongst the Southeast Asian identity? You know?
It's an everyday problem in our museum. This question of Southeast Asia and in art as well. But there's no fast and easy response to that complicated question, except to maybe present the complexity of Southeast Asia as a geopolitical construction from colonialism and the Cold War, and also how it's located in the imagination as a place east of China, west of, is it east of China? South of China, east of India, sorry. South of China, east of India, north of Australia. And but it's also a very complex modern history with a series of transformations brought about by like westernization or Indianization, Sinicization, Islamization, intense colonialism too, intense migration. So yeah, it's a very interesting region to study, and also very, maybe also resists easy capture in terms of representation in art history or representation in any kind of history. But we took it upon ourselves as practitioners in the region to reflect on this question of Southeast Asia. So it's not a fixed, conclusive. We don't impose a fixed and conclusive assertion on or claim on the region. So it's like an ongoing speculation on on how it circulates in the present.
Yeah. I would just like to add something, is because we are thinking about new categories, but when thinking about the interwar period, we have to use an old category, which is nationalism, because nationalism is everywhere, because of course it's the end of the colonial period. You have the rise of the nations, and in the same time it happens in Paris, in Europe, when you have also war coming and the rise of nationalism in Europe. And we can't avoid to say that the representatives of the different Asian countries in Paris, even artists, they are also competing with each other. It's a competitive space. And for instance, if we take the case of the museum, Musée du Jeu de Paume, Japan and China. So you have first the Japanese exhibition, and for the Chinese artists, it's a challenge. They want to have a Chinese exhibition, and so there is the Japanese exhibition, the Chinese exhibition, and very strangely, one of the very last exhibition before the war is a monographic exhibition of Zhang Shanzi. And Zhang Shanzi is really using the space of the Musée du Jeu de Paume as a place to make the French audience realize that the war already started in Asia. And actually it's about to start in Europe. So I think we can't avoid to think about nationalism to understand this period, and sometimes even smaller categories can be useful. I think about the different diasporas, people looking at migration sometimes. They also realize that one area, one city, or one area sharing the same language and the same culture, they can have a huge impact. For instance, in the case of China, you have the Cantonese community. They are very important. And even in art, when you realize among Lefebvre and his friends, there are many people coming from this area. So this is also something maybe useful, smaller categories to think about.
Like more interlocal, I think.
Yes.
The interlocal as more than like the national, right? I think is a more productive category to understand what's really happening on the ground. No? Yeah. So I think on that, there's one. Okay. It's Francesca, no? Yeah, yeah. Hello, Francesca. She supports the idea that there's a back and forth movement, and she also proposes this concept of a resounding practice. A resounding practice that is not one way, and something that might go beyond the dichotomy. But on the other hand, she also asks, maybe it also reinforces the dichotomy. Anyway, like Francesca, we are all speculating on a new theory on this relationship. But I like the metaphor of echo, because that's what she uses in the question. Echo or resounding, the idea of resounding. So I think we have to change our metaphors too. Maybe we could turn to music or sound to say, to describe what's happening, like vibration or echo, resonance, rather than influence or other deterministic concepts of diffusion. Yeah, that's it, right? Okay, so on that, do I close the? Okay. Okay. So thank you all.
All right. Thank you to all our speakers for their wonderful sharing.